Hello, Night Seekers. Welcome to Black Screen Horror. Relax, close your eyes, and enjoy true scary stories with gentle rain. Like, subscribe, and comment if you enjoy the journey. Sweet dreams, if you dare. I know I'm coming to this a little late compared to when it actually happened, but I still think it's worth putting into words, because these two experiences completely changed how I think about things I used to dismiss without a second thought. For most of my life growing up, I was the skeptical one in my family. The kid who rolled her eyes whenever anyone brought up ghost stories or talked about things going bump in the night, always assuming there had to be some rational explanation underneath every strange claim if you just looked hard enough. Two specific things happened in the house I grew up in that changed that completely. And even now, years later, I still find myself thinking about both of them more than I'd like to admit. The first incident happened when I was 14. My bedroom was on the second floor of our house, and understanding the layout of that house is actually important to what happened. So I want to take a moment to lay it out clearly before getting into the story itself. My dad often ended up sleeping downstairs on the couch instead of in bed with my mom, mostly because their mattress was one of those old-fashioned heated water beds, and he had a habit of overheating in it during the night, no matter how low they kept the temperature setting. He'd usually start the night upstairs and end up migrating down to the couch sometime after everyone else had gone to sleep, which meant on any given night there was a decent chance of finding him camped out down there instead of in the actual bedroom. If you walked out of my bedroom door upstairs, you'd be looking directly into my parents' bedroom across the hallway, and to the right of that would be the staircase leading down to the ground floor. At the bottom of those stairs, you'd land in the living room, and if you turned left from there, you'd walk through the dining room before either continuing straight into the kitchen or veering left down a short little hallway that led to the bathroom. We always kept a small light on somewhere downstairs overnight, mostly for the benefit of whoever got up in the middle of the night needing to use the restroom, just enough to keep you from stumbling around blind in the dark on the way there and back. That house had been our home for as long as I could remember, an older place my parents had bought when I was still a toddler, full of the kind of quirks and creaks that old houses accumulate over the years. Uneven floorboards in the upstairs hallway, a kitchen faucet that dripped no matter how many times my dad tried to fix it, a basement door that never quite latched properly, no matter how hard you pulled it shut. I never thought much about any of it before that night. Never paid particular attention to the way sound carried through the stairwell, or how the glass in that front door could catch and hold reflections from almost anywhere in the downstairs living space if the angle was right. It was just the house I'd grown up in. Familiar in every way, a house becomes familiar to a kid who spent their whole life inside it. Every creak and shadow already cataloged and dismissed as ordinary long before that particular night ever gave me a reason to look at any of it differently. I woke up around 3 a.m. that particular night needing to pee, the way you sometimes do without any warning, fully alert the moment my eyes opened, even though it was the middle of the night. I got out of bed and made my way toward the stairs, still groggy but functional enough to navigate the familiar path down to the bathroom without needing to think too hard about it. The house was completely silent around me, the kind of deep quiet that settles over a home in the very early hours, broken only by the soft sound of my own footsteps on the carpeted stairs and the faint hum of the refrigerator somewhere off in the kitchen. When I reached the bottom of the steps and started to make the right turn toward the bathroom hallway, something caught my attention. There was a reflection visible in the glass of our front door, which sat directly across from the bathroom entrance, positioned in exactly the right spot to catch and reflect whatever was happening in that little hallway. In that reflection, I could clearly see the shape of my dad walking out of the bathroom, his silhouette catching just enough of that small nightlight glow to be unmistakable, the particular way he carried his shoulders when he was tired, the shuffle of his walk that I'd recognize anywhere even half asleep myself. He's not exactly a pleasant person to run into first thing after waking up in the middle of the night. He gets groggy and grumpy in a way that made me instinctively want to avoid crossing paths with him in that narrow hallway if I could help it. Especially at 3 in the morning when neither of us would have had the patience for the awkward little dance of trying to squeeze past each other in a tight space, both of us half asleep and irritable in that particular way people get when woken from a deep sleep for something as mundane as needing the bathroom. So instead of continuing forward, I sat down on the bottom step of the staircase, figuring I'd just wait a moment for him to finish making his way back to the couch before I continued on to the bathroom myself. It seemed like the easiest solution, the path of least resistance for two half-asleep people trying to avoid an unnecessary collision in a cramped hallway. I sat there for a moment, still fuzzy with sleep, and it took me a beat longer than it probably should have to register something that didn't quite add up properly. He hadn't walked past me toward the couch yet. I'd seen him clearly in that reflection, walking out of the bathroom, moving in the direction that should have brought him right past where I was sitting on the stairs within a few seconds. But those seconds had passed, and there was no sign of him, no footsteps, no shape moving through the living room toward the couch. Nothing at all beyond the same quiet stillness that had been there the whole time. And then, at that exact moment, sitting there on the bottom step trying to make sense of why my dad hadn't appeared yet, I heard it clearly. A snore, low and unmistakable, drifting from the direction of the couch. My dad was fast asleep on that couch. He had been fast asleep on that couch the entire time I'd been sitting there. The entire time I'd watched what I thought was his reflection walking out of the bathroom in the glass of our front door. I don't think I've ever moved that fast in my entire life, before or since. I bolted up those stairs, taking them faster than I've ever taken a staircase, and locked myself in my bedroom the second I got inside, my heart absolutely pounding, every hair on my body standing on end, my whole body shaking in a way I couldn't fully control even once I was safely behind a locked door. I decided in that moment that whatever I needed to do about the fact that I still desperately had to pee, it was not worth going back down those stairs to find out. I held it until morning, wide awake in my bed with the door locked, listening to every small sound the house made for what felt like hours before I finally managed to drift off again, straining to hear if any footsteps might follow me up those stairs, half convinced every creak of the old house settling was something worse. I remember lying there staring at my closed bedroom door for a long time, watching the thin strip of hallway light beneath it, waiting to see if a shadow might pass across that gap the way one had appeared in that glass door downstairs. And it felt like an eternity before my body finally gave out from exhaustion and let me sleep. Even with my bladder still uncomfortably full and my nerves still completely on edge. I told my parents about it the next morning, trying to explain as clearly as I could what I had seen and heard, the reflection, the missing footsteps, the snore confirming my dad had never actually left that couch at all. They didn't take it particularly seriously. My parents told me I'd let my imagination get the best of me, that I was still half asleep and had probably misread some ordinary shadow or trick of the light reflecting off that glass door, easy enough to do at 3 in the morning when your brain isn't fully awake yet. My dad, in particular, seemed almost amused by the whole thing, teasing me lightly over breakfast about seeing ghosts in the hallway, which only made me more reluctant to keep pushing the point, even though every part of me knew exactly what I'd seen and heard that night. I didn't have a good enough argument to push back against that explanation at the time, and honestly, some part of me wanted to believe them, wanted there to be some simple, boring answer that would let me stop thinking about it and go back to feeling safe in my own house. Over the following few weeks, though, small strange things kept happening around the house that I mostly brushed off individually, telling myself each one had some reasonable explanation, even if I couldn't immediately think of what it was. Odd noises at night that didn't match anything I could identify. Soft creaks that seemed to come from empty rooms. The occasional sense that a door I'd left open had somehow ended up closed without anyone in the house admitting to touching it. A feeling every so often of being watched while sitting alone in a room that should have been empty. A prickling awareness at the back of my neck that would make me glance up from whatever I was doing, only to find nothing there. No explanation, no source. Just the ordinary stillness of an empty room staring back at me. Nothing dramatic enough on its own to bring back up to my parents after how the first conversation had gone, so I just kept quiet about it and tried not to dwell on any of it too much, filing each small incident away without connecting them into any larger pattern. Telling myself I was simply more on edge after that first night than I used to be. More prone to noticing things that had probably always been happening, but that I'd never paid close enough attention to before. Looking back now, I wonder how many of those small moments I dismissed too quickly during those weeks, how many might have actually been connected to whatever had made that reflection appear in our front door, or whatever would eventually cast that shadow across my computer screen months later. At the time, I had no reason to link any of it together. It was only after the second incident that I started replaying those weeks in my head, wondering if I'd been living alongside something the entire time without fully registering just how present it had actually been. Fast forward a couple of months, and I was 15 by then, sitting at the family computer in our living room one evening. It was around 8 at night. My dad was working late that day, so it was just my mom and me in the house. She was upstairs cleaning, running the vacuum through one of the bedrooms, while I sat downstairs at the computer listening to music on YouTube and generally passing time doing whatever a 15-year-old does at a shared family computer in the evening. I had a pair of over-the-ear headphones on, but I've never liked feeling completely cut off from my surroundings, so I had a habit of keeping one side turned slightly outward, angled away from my ear just enough that I could still catch ambient sound from the room around me, even while music played through the other side. It was a small habit, something I'd developed without really thinking about it, but it meant I was never fully isolated from whatever else was going on in the house while I sat there. I'd started doing it years earlier, honestly, and I couldn't tell you exactly when or why, only that some part of me had never been comfortable sitting somewhere with both ears completely covered. Some low-level need to stay tuned in to my surroundings, even during ordinary, unremarkable moments like sitting at a computer on a regular Tuesday evening. The lighting in our living room came from fixtures set into the ceiling, bright enough that if someone walked up and stood directly behind me while I sat at that computer, their shadow would fall clearly across the screen in front of me. Impossible to miss, even out of the corner of my eye. My mom actually did this fairly often, walking up quietly behind me just to peek over my shoulder at whatever I was doing, mostly just to annoy me the way parents sometimes do. An ordinary little habit of hers that I had grown completely used to over the years. I could usually tell it was her before she even said anything, just from the particular rhythm of her footsteps and the way she always paused for a beat right behind my chair before actually commenting on whatever was on the screen. So when I faintly heard the vacuum shut off somewhere upstairs, followed a second later by the familiar sound of jean cuffs brushing against carpet, the particular soft swish of fabric moving across the floor that I associated instantly with someone walking up behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. It sounded exactly like my mom coming to check on me after finishing whatever section of the house she'd been vacuuming. The same routine I'd experienced dozens of times before. A shadow fell across my screen a moment later, right on cue, confirming what my ears had already told me. Someone was standing directly behind me. I pulled off my headphones and turned around, already halfway through forming the words to ask my mom what she wanted this time, already bracing for whatever comment she was about to make about whatever I had pulled up on the screen. Nobody was there. The space behind my chair was completely empty. No one standing there, no shadow falling across anything anymore. Nothing but the ordinary bright glow of the ceiling lights filling the room exactly the way they always did. I sat there for a second, completely thrown, my mind struggling to reconcile what I'd just heard and felt with what I was now looking at. An empty living room with absolutely no explanation for the footsteps, the shadow, any of it. I actually got up out of the chair and turned in a full circle, checking behind the couch, glancing toward the kitchen doorway. Some part of me still convinced there had to be a simple explanation, waiting just out of my immediate line of sight. A coat rack casting an odd shape, a curtain moving in a draft. Anything that could account for what I'd just experienced. There was nothing. The room was exactly as still and empty as it had been before I'd sat down at that computer an hour earlier. I called out for my mom loud enough that my voice cracked slightly with the effort, and she answered from upstairs almost immediately, her voice coming from clearly above me. Nowhere near the living room. Nowhere near where that shadow had just fallen across my screen seconds earlier. I don't think I have ever run up a staircase faster in my entire life, taking those steps two at a time, my heart hammering in my chest in a way that felt almost identical to that night 3 years earlier when I'd bolted up those same stairs after hearing my dad snoring on a couch he supposedly hadn't left. I could smell something faintly burnt in the air, even from the bottom of the stairs. A sharp, acrid tinge that got stronger the closer I got to the top, though at the time I was moving too fast and too scared to process what that smell might mean. When I found her, still standing in the room she'd been vacuuming, unplugged vacuum cleaner sitting beside her with a thin curl of smoke still rising faintly from its base, I asked her, breathless and shaking slightly, if she'd just come downstairs to stand behind me at the computer. She looked at me like I was asking something completely unexpected, telling me no, she hadn't left that room at all. She'd been vacuuming the entire time until just a moment ago. But then, she told me something that made the whole situation somehow even worse than if she'd simply confirmed she hadn't been downstairs. She explained that she hadn't actually turned the vacuum off herself. The belt inside it, an old one that had clearly been due for replacement for a while, had snapped in half on its own, and the machine had immediately started smoking from the motor, overheating without that belt in place to keep everything running properly. She'd had to scramble to unplug it and pull it away from the carpet before it could actually catch fire or damage the flooring, dealing with a sudden malfunction in the exact same instant that I'd heard footsteps and felt a shadow fall across my computer screen downstairs, in a room where nobody but me was supposedly present. She hadn't even heard me call her name at first, she said, too focused on making sure the vacuum wasn't going to actually start a fire right there in the bedroom, and it had taken my second, louder call before she'd registered anything happening downstairs at all. The timing of it settled over me slowly as she explained what had happened. The realization that whatever I'd heard and felt behind me hadn't come from her at all, couldn't have come from her, since she'd been fully occupied upstairs, dealing with a smoking vacuum cleaner at the exact same moment. Two completely separate, seemingly unrelated things had happened in different parts of the house at precisely the same second, and somehow, standing there in that upstairs room with the smell of burnt rubber still lingering in the air, that felt far more unsettling than either event would have on its own. I remember standing there in silence, for a long moment after she finished explaining. Neither of us quite sure what to say next. Both of us just staring at that smoking vacuum sitting between us like it somehow held the answer to what had just happened downstairs. I don't have any clean explanation for either of these two incidents. Not then and not now, years later, looking back on both of them with whatever extra perspective adulthood is supposed to provide. I've turned them over in my head more times than I can count, trying to find some rational thread connecting the reflection in that glass door to a snoring man who supposedly hadn't moved, trying to make sense of footsteps and a shadow appearing behind me at the exact moment a vacuum cleaner failed 2 floors away with nobody standing anywhere near my chair. Nothing ever quite adds up cleanly enough to fully dismiss either experience the way I used to dismiss stories like this when other people told them to me. I've tried applying every logical explanation I can think of. Tricks of light, coincidental timing, an overactive imagination working overtime on 2 separate occasions years apart. And none of them hold up completely once I actually sit down and walk through the details of what happened both times. I think about that house sometimes still, even though my family moved out of it years ago, and I wonder occasionally about who or what might have actually still been living inside it alongside us during those years, occupying the same rooms and hallways we walk through every day without ever fully revealing itself except in those 2 brief, unmistakable moments. I've never been able to shake the memory of sitting on that bottom step in the middle of the night, watching a reflection of my father walk out of a bathroom he apparently never entered, or the feeling of a shadow falling across my computer screen from someone who was supposedly 2 floors away dealing with an entirely unrelated emergency at the exact same instant. Both memories still feel just as vivid to me now as they did the nights they happened. Sharp enough that I could describe every detail of both rooms without hesitation, even all these years later. My parents, even after the second incident, still didn't fully come around to believing anything unusual had actually happened in that house, chalking up the shadow and the footsteps to some coincidence of timing and imagination working together to create a false impression in my head. My mom, in particular, seemed more concerned with the practical matter of the broken vacuum than with anything I was trying to describe about what I'd heard and felt at the exact same moment it failed. Already talking about which store to visit for a replacement before I'd even finished explaining what had happened downstairs. I stopped trying quite as hard after that to convince anyone else in my family that something genuinely strange had happened. Not because I'd talked myself out of believing it myself, but because I understood by then that no amount of explaining the timing or the details was going to change minds that had already decided there was nothing more to it than an overactive teenage imagination working overtime. These days, whenever anyone brings up paranormal stories or asks whether I believe in that kind of thing, I always think back to that house first, to those 2 specific nights, years apart, that never fit into any explanation I've ever been able to construct for myself. I used to be someone who needed hard proof before believing in anything outside the ordinary. Someone who would have listened to a story exactly like this one and quietly assumed the person telling it had simply gotten spooked by nothing at all. I don't get to be that person anymore, not after living through both of those nights myself, not after sitting frozen on a staircase listening to a snore that shouldn't have been possible, or turning around at that computer to find an empty room where a shadow had just been standing seconds before. I still catch myself thinking about that house sometimes, especially late at night, wondering whether whatever was there ever actually left when my family eventually moved out, or whether it's still there now, waiting behind some other family's front door, casting reflections and shadows for someone else entirely, someone who has no idea yet what they're actually sharing their home with. I've never gone back to visit the new owners or ask if they've experienced anything similar, mostly because I'm not entirely sure I want to know the answer. Some questions feel better left unasked. And after everything that happened in that house during those years, I've learned to trust that instinct more than I used to. I was around 12 years old when my friend invited me to stay over for his birthday. And looking back now, it's strange how ordinary that whole evening felt right up until the exact moment it stopped being ordinary at all. He lived out near an orchard field in Yakima, Washington, in one of those houses set back a fair distance from the road, with nothing but open land and rows of trees stretching out behind it, for what felt like miles when you were a kid standing at the edge of the yard looking out. The house itself was nothing unusual. A single-story ranch-style place with a big wraparound porch his dad had built on himself. The kind of house that felt lived in and comfortable, full of family photos and the smell of whatever his mom had been baking that week. It was the kind of place that made you feel completely safe the moment you walked through the door, which somehow made everything that happened later that night feel even more disorienting by comparison. My older brother came along with me. He was 14 at the time, along with a handful of other friends from school, and the plan for the night was about as simple and unremarkable as birthday sleepovers usually are. We watched a movie crammed together on the couch and the floor in front of it, ate more cake than any of us probably should have, and let the evening stretch on the way evenings do at that age, when nobody wants to be the first one to suggest going to sleep. My friend's mom kept popping her head into the living room every so often to check on us, refilling snack bowls, telling us to keep the volume down since his little sister was already asleep down the hall. The ordinary background noise of a normal family home on a normal Friday night. It started getting pretty late at some point, late enough that the house had gone quiet except for us, the adults having gone to bed or retreated to another part of the house entirely, leaving us to entertain ourselves the way groups of preteen boys tend to do once left alone, with no real supervision and no real bedtime being enforced. My friend's dog had gone missing a couple of days before the party, run off from the yard sometime that week and never come back, and it had clearly been weighing on him the entire night, even though he tried not to make a big deal out of it in front of everyone. He'd mentioned it a couple times during the movie. Quiet asides about how the dog usually slept at the foot of his bed and how strange the house felt without him there, and I could tell underneath the birthday excitement there was a real current of worry running through him that none of us quite knew how to address. At some point, sitting around after the movie ended, I brought up the idea that we should go look for the dog that night, since we actually had a decent group of us there for once, more than enough people to spread out and cover ground that would have been impossible to search alone. We were also just the kind of kids who liked running around outside in the dark, exploring things we probably shouldn't have been exploring. So the idea landed well with everyone almost immediately. Nobody needed much convincing. It sounded like an adventure, and none of us were thinking about it as anything more serious than that. We rounded up what flashlights we could find in the house. A couple of decent ones and a couple of weaker ones that barely cut through the dark, along with a pair of binoculars someone grabbed off a shelf without much thought and headed out from the house toward the orchard behind it. My friend's mom, half asleep by then, gave us a distracted warning to stay close to the property and not wander too far. The kind of warning parents give without really expecting kids to listen, and none of us really did. The night air out there felt different from town, colder somehow, thinner, carrying sounds further than they had any business traveling. I remember how quiet everything got the moment we stepped off the porch and away from the house, the ordinary sounds of the sleepover, the television, the muffled voices, all of it fading behind us until there was nothing left but our own footsteps and the occasional call for the dog's name drifting out into the dark. We started off along the road bordering the property before cutting onto some of the beaten trails that ran through the orchard itself, trails worn down over years by whoever tended those trees, winding between the rows before eventually pushing deeper into land that felt less and less like anyone's property, and more like just open wilderness stretching out in every direction. The trees themselves stood in orderly rows at first, planted decades ago by someone with a plan and a purpose. But the further we walked, the less orderly everything became. The orchard slowly giving way to older, wilder growth that nobody had planted or pruned in years. There was a particular stretch where the trail narrowed down to almost nothing, forcing us to walk single file for a few minutes, branches brushing against our shoulders on both sides, the flashlight beams ahead of us, the only real guide through ground that had gone soft and uneven underfoot. I remember one of my friends tripping over an exposed root somewhere in that stretch, and the whole group laughing about it. Still light and easy in that particular way kids are before anything has actually gone wrong yet, before the night had given us any real reason to be afraid. Eventually, the orchard gave way to something wilder, a stretch where a creek cut through the land and a series of hills rose up on the far side of it, dark shapes against an even darker sky, the kind of landscape that looks completely different at night than it ever does in daylight. At that point in the walk, we weren't being especially careful or quiet. We were kids on what felt like a fun nighttime mission, calling out for the dog every so often, talking among ourselves, flashlight beams swinging around in wide, careless arcs across the grass and the trees, not remotely prepared for anything to actually happen. The creek ran shallow and loud enough to hear from a distance, the sound of it filling in the quiet between our own voices, and the hills on the far side rose up dark and featureless against a sky that had enough moonlight to make out shapes, but not enough to make out any real detail. I remember someone joking about Bigfoot at some point during that stretch of the walk. The kind of joke kids make specifically to entertain the idea of being scared without actually believing anything might come of it. And a couple of us laughed it off and kept walking, kept calling the dog's name into the dark like nothing was different about that particular night compared to any other. I remember the specific stretch of ground we were crossing when everything changed. Right along the edge of the creek, with those hills rising up ahead of us on the other side, the flashlight beams barely reaching far enough to make out anything beyond the closest few yards of grass. The group had spread out a little by then, some of us closer to the water, others hanging back near the tree line, all of us still calling out for the dog, still treating the whole thing like an adventure rather than anything to actually take seriously. I caught something out of the corner of my eye before I consciously registered what I was looking at, a shape standing at the top of one of those hills, still and upright against the night sky, in a way that didn't immediately register as strange until I actually stopped and looked directly at it. My first instinct was that it had to be a person, someone else out in the orchard that night, for reasons of their own, standing up there watching us the same way we might have watched anyone else moving through the dark. I pulled the binoculars up to get a better look, wanting to confirm what I thought I was seeing before saying anything to the rest of the group and potentially embarrassing myself over nothing. By the time I got the binoculars focused and looked again, it was already moving. Not standing anymore, not still, but running straight down the slope of that hill directly toward where we were standing at the edge of the creek. It was massive. Even accounting for how much a kid's mind can exaggerate something, seen briefly in the dark at a distance, I remember being certain, immediately and completely certain, that whatever I was looking at was far too large to be any person I'd ever seen. It looked covered in dark fur or hair, thick enough that I could make out the texture of it even through shaky binoculars and poor light. And it was moving on two legs, upright, covering ground with long, powerful strides that ate up the distance between the top of that hill and the creek far faster than felt natural for something that size. My hands were shaking so badly by that point that keeping the binoculars steady took real effort, and every time the image jumped or blurred, I had to fight the urge to just drop them and run right then, before I'd even fully confirmed what I was looking at. Time seemed to slow down and speed up at the same time, in a way I still can't fully describe. Seconds stretching out long enough for me to register every detail of the shape moving toward us, and simultaneously collapsing so fast that it felt like almost no time passed at all between first spotting it on the hilltop and watching it close half the distance to the creek. The whole scene playing out with a strange, dreamlike distortion that I've never experienced before or since in quite the same way. For a moment, I genuinely thought my eyes had to be playing tricks on me, that some combination of darkness and distance and adrenaline was warping what I was actually seeing into something my mind wanted to make more dramatic than it really was. But then I noticed something that undid every attempt I was making to explain it away. The tall grass on that hillside was flattening behind it as it ran, a clear, visible wave of movement in the grass, tracking its exact path down the slope, bending and springing back in its wake, the same way grass does when something heavy and real moves through it. That wasn't something my imagination could have added on its own. Whatever I was looking at was physically there, physically moving, physically disturbing the ground beneath it, in a way that left no room for me to talk myself into believing it was some trick of shadow and moonlight. I couldn't process it fully on my own. I remember my hands actually trembling as I pulled the binoculars away from my face, my heart already hammering, my mouth suddenly dry in a way that had nothing to do with the walk we'd been on, my whole body flooded with an adrenaline I didn't know what to do with, and I turned to my brother standing next to me and shoved the binoculars toward him without fully explaining what I'd just seen, just telling him to look right now, up at the hill, across the creek. He grabbed them from me without much hesitation, still not understanding the urgency in my voice, and lifted them up to his own eyes, scanning the hillside for whatever I was so shaken about. He held those binoculars up for maybe 5 seconds. That's all it took. 5 seconds of looking through them before he dropped them straight onto the ground, not even bothering to lower them carefully, and turned and ran. He didn't say a single word, not one syllable, not a warning to the rest of us, not even our names called out over his shoulder. He simply bolted, sprinting back the way we'd come, back through the orchard, back toward the house, faster than I had ever seen him move in my entire life up to that point. The rest of us stood there for a second, completely thrown by watching him take off like that, without any explanation, and then, without needing much more convincing than the sight of a 14-year-old running for his life in complete silence, the rest of us broke into a run right behind him. I remember the exact feeling of that moment more clearly than almost anything else from that whole night. The way fear can spread through a group without a single word being exchanged. The way watching someone else's terror can override every instinct telling you to stop and ask what's actually happening. None of us stopped to look back toward the hill ourselves. None of us needed to. My brother's silence said more than any explanation could have, and every one of us understood on some primal level that whatever he'd seen through those binoculars was bad enough that the only correct response was to run and keep running until we were somewhere safe. I don't remember much about the run back through the orchard itself, only fragments. Flashlight beams bouncing wildly across the ground, branches and low growth catching at our legs, everyone breathing too hard to talk. Nobody daring to look back over their shoulder to check whether whatever had been running down that hill was following us or not. All I know is that we made it back to the house together, all of us, out of breath and shaking. And once we were inside with the door shut behind us, The reality of what had just happened settled over the group in a way that made talking about it feel almost impossible. My friend never did find his dog that night, or as far as I know, ever again after that. Nobody brought up finishing the search. Nobody suggested going back out. We just sat there in that living room trying to catch our breath, glancing at each other like we were each hoping someone else would be the first to say out loud what we'd all just witnessed. My friend's mom came out of her room at some point, woken up by the sound of the front door slamming and a group of panicked kids piling into the living room in the middle of the night. And none of us really knew how to explain to her what had just happened. We ended up telling her some watered-down version of the truth, that we'd seen something big out by the creek and gotten scared and run back, and she seemed to accept it as exactly the kind of thing that happens when a bunch of 12 and 14-year-olds go wandering around in the dark, telling each other stories to scare themselves. She checked the locks on the doors, told us to settle down and get some sleep, and went back to bed without pressing much further, completely unaware of how close any of us had come to actually believing we might not make it back to that house at all. None of us slept much the rest of that night. We ended up piling every mattress and blanket we could find into the living room and staying together in one room until sunrise. Nobody willing to say it out loud, but all of us clearly feeling safer in a group than we would have felt splitting off into separate rooms the way the original sleepover plan had intended. My brother didn't say much about it that night either, not right away. It took him a while, sitting there in the house with the rest of us, before he could get any words out at all about what he'd actually seen through those binoculars in the 5 seconds before he dropped them and ran. Even then, what he said didn't add much detail beyond what I'd already seen myself. Just confirmation. Quiet and shaken. That it hadn't been a person. That it had been huge. That it had been running straight at us on 2 legs like nothing he'd ever seen before in his life. He's never been able to describe much more than that. Not then and not in all the years since, no matter how many times our family has asked him to try. I've asked him myself, more than once over the years, whether the binoculars had shown him anything more specific. A face, eyes, some detail that might help either of us make sense of what we'd seen. He always says the same thing, that it happened too fast, that 5 seconds isn't enough time to take in details when your entire body is screaming at you to run. That all he really registered was size and speed and the absolute certainty that it was closing the distance between the hill and the creek faster than anything human or animal should have been able to move. He's told me a few times that he still isn't sure exactly what made him drop the binoculars and run instead of saying something to warn the rest of us first. He just says his body made the decision before his mind caught up. The same way mine had a few minutes earlier when I first spotted the shape on the hilltop and felt that instinctive wave of wrongness before I'd even consciously understood what I was looking at. I'm 22 now, and my brother is 24. And every so often, usually around the holidays when the whole family gets together and conversation drifts toward old stories, that night comes back up. Our mom loves bringing it up more than either of us really want her to. Always with the same mixture of amusement and genuine unease in her voice, half treating it like a funny story about 2 kids getting spooked in the dark, and half seeming to actually believe something happened out there that neither of us have ever fully explained. She wasn't there that night, of course. She only ever heard it secondhand from us and from the phone call my friend's mom made to her the next morning. But somehow, over the years, she's become one of the people most fascinated by the story, bringing it up at family dinners and asking us again and again to walk through exactly what we saw. Like she's hoping one of these tellings will finally produce some detail we'd forgotten before. My brother and I don't talk about it often, between just the 2 of us, but on the rare occasions we do, we always land in the exact same place we landed that first night sitting shaken in my friend's living room. We don't know what it was. Neither of us has ever come up with a satisfying explanation for what we saw crossing that hillside and closing the distance toward us with the grass flattening in its wake. We've gone back and forth over the years trying out different theories. A bear standing upright. Someone in a costume playing an elaborate and cruel prank. Some trick of moonlight and adrenaline that neither of us can quite recreate in memory. None of the explanations ever fully satisfy either of us. Bears don't run like that. A costume wouldn't move the way that thing moved, wouldn't cover ground that fast with strides that long. And moonlight doesn't flatten grass. But we've never once disagreed on the one thing we're both completely certain of, even after all these years. Whatever it wasn't human. Every now and then, usually late at night, when my mind wanders somewhere it shouldn't, I think back to that stretch of land behind my friend's house. The creek, the hills, the tall grass bending under something that moved on two legs but ran like nothing I'd ever seen before. I've been back to Yakima a handful of times since then for family visits, and I've driven past roads bordering orchards more than once, always finding my eyes drifting toward the tree lines and the distant hills without quite meaning to. Some old part of me still half expecting to catch a glimpse of that same shape standing still at the top of a rise, waiting, watching, the way it had been watching us that night before it started running. My friend moved away from that house years ago, and I've lost touch with him the way you lose touch with a lot of people from that age, but I still think about his dog sometimes, too, about how it disappeared just days before that birthday party and never turned up again. No trace, no sighting. Nothing the family ever found, despite searching for weeks afterward. I don't know if the two things are connected. I don't know if they could be. But whenever I think about that night, the dog going missing and that thing coming down the hill toward us always end up sitting side by side in my memory. Two mysteries from the same stretch of land that neither my brother nor I have ever managed to explain. And honestly, at this point, I'm not sure either of us really wants to. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd kept walking that night instead of turning around. If we'd pushed further into that orchard looking for the dog before any of this happened, whether we would have crossed paths with whatever was out there under different circumstances entirely. I try not to dwell on it too much. There's a particular kind of unease that comes with imagining alternate versions of a night that already scared you enough the first time around, and I've learned over the years that it's better for my own peace of mind to just accept what happened and leave the what-ifs alone. Still, every time that memory resurfaces, whether it's my mom bringing it up at a family dinner or some unrelated conversation about the woods or the outdoors triggering it on its own, I find myself right back at the edge of that creek, watching the grass flatten under something running straight toward me, feeling 12 years old again for just a moment before the memory lets go and I'm back in the present, sitting somewhere warm and safe, trying to explain to whoever's listening why I still can't quite shake it after all these years. Every so often I catch myself wondering whether other kids from that town ever had similar encounters out along that same stretch of orchard and hillside, whether there are other stories floating around out there that never made it back to me. Other groups of teenagers who wandered a little too far past the tree line one night and came running back with the same wide-eyed silence my brother wore that night. I've never gone looking for those stories, never asked around online or dug through local forums the way some people might, mostly because I'm not sure I actually want confirmation one way or the other. It's easier, in some strange way, to let it stay exactly what it's been for the last 10 years, a story my family tells at dinner, a memory my brother and I still can't fully explain, and nothing more than that. We moved into that house the year I started 5th grade, and looking back now, I think my parents were so caught up in the excitement of finally finding a place with enough space and enough land around it that they missed every single warning sign in the house, and the man selling it were practically shouting at them. It was an old place, the kind with good bones, as my dad liked to say, sitting on a decent stretch of land out past the edge of town, where the houses started spacing themselves further apart, and the fields took over. The man we bought it from hadn't wanted to sell. Not really. His wife had inherited another house somewhere else, and from what I understood as a kid, listening in on adult conversations I wasn't supposed to be part of, that was the only reason they were leaving at all. He never seemed happy about it, not once. Not during any of the walkthroughs or the closing or the weeks leading up to us actually moving our things in. The upstairs of the house wasn't finished when we bought it. It was really just a skeleton of a second floor. Stud walls standing bare, with only a few scattered pieces of sheetrock hung here and there, insulation hanging loose out of the gaps, chunks of wood and construction debris littering the floor like the whole space had been abandoned mid-project years earlier and never picked back up. My parents saw potential in it. I think that unfinished upstairs was actually part of what excited them so much. The idea that they could build it out exactly the way they wanted once we were in. It was an unusual find for the area, and they were thrilled, even with how much trouble the man gave them throughout the whole process of buying the place. He fought them on almost everything, dragging his feet on paperwork, showing up unannounced during the final walkthroughs, making comments that always seemed to carry some edge my parents chose to brush off as simple bitterness about losing the house. At one point, my parents asked him, reasonably, to clear out the construction debris scattered across the unfinished upstairs before we officially moved in. Instead of doing that, my brother arrived one afternoon to check on the progress and found the man out in the backyard, ripping the remaining scraps of sheetrock and insulation out of the upstairs walls with his bare hands and burning them in a pile in the yard, like he'd rather destroy what little was there than leave it behind for the family replacing him. That should have told us something. It didn't, not really, not until later, when we discovered something far worse waiting for us after we'd already moved everything in and settled into our new rooms. Somewhere during those first few weeks of living there, we found out that the man had shoved human feces down the air vents of the house before he left. I don't know exactly when my parents discovered it, or how they even figured out what had caused the smell that kept creeping through certain rooms, no matter how much they cleaned, but I remember the horror on their faces when they finally understood what they were dealing with. And I remember thinking, even at 10 years old, that a man doesn't do something like that out of simple spite over losing a house sale. That's not the kind of thing an ordinary, bitter person does. There's something else underneath an act like that. Something angrier and stranger than plain resentment. And I think some small part of me decided right then that this house had been left to us with more baggage than just bad plumbing and an unfinished second floor. Somewhere during those first few weeks of living there, we found out that the man had shoved human feces down the air vents of the house before he left. I don't know exactly when my parents discovered it, or how they even figured out what had caused the smell that kept creeping through certain rooms no matter how much they cleaned, but I remember the horror on their faces when they finally understood what they were dealing with. And I remember thinking, even at 10 years old, that a man doesn't do something like that out of simple spite over losing a house sale. That's not the kind of thing an ordinary bitter person does. There's something else underneath an act like that. Something angrier and stranger than plain resentment, and I think some small part of me decided right then that this house had been left to us with more baggage than just bad plumbing and an unfinished second floor. I remember my dad spending an entire weekend with a shop vac and a mask over his face, working his way through vent after vent. My mom scrubbing every surface in the kitchen twice over, even though nothing in the kitchen had actually been touched. Nobody explained the full extent of what they found to me and my brother at the time, not really, but kids pick up on more than adults think they do. And I understood well enough from the hushed conversations and the grim set of my parents' faces that whatever had happened was worse than a simple prank or an act of petty revenge. It felt personal in a way that didn't make sense for a stranger who barely knew us. It felt like something meant to leave a mark on the house itself, not just on the people moving into it. I disliked that house from almost the very beginning, even setting aside everything with the previous owner. It was noisy in a way that never felt like ordinary old house settling. When we first moved in, my mom started complaining about sounds like something falling off a shelf and shattering on the floor, sharp and sudden and unmistakable, the kind of sound that makes you drop what you're doing and go check immediately. Every single time she ran into whatever room the sound had come from, she found everything sitting exactly where it should have been. Nothing broken. Nothing out of place. Nothing to explain what she just heard so clearly through the walls. I was present for one of those times myself, standing close enough to hear it too, so I know for certain she wasn't imagining it or exaggerating for effect. My mother has never been the type of person to make things up or dramatize ordinary noises into something more sinister. If she said she heard something shatter, something had made that exact sound, whether or not we ever found the source of it. For a long stretch after we moved in, before the upstairs was finished, I would wake up most nights somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving somewhere in the house at an hour when everyone should have been asleep. I would lie there frozen under my blankets, imagining every worst-case scenario a 10-year-old's mind could conjure up. Absolutely convinced a burglar had broken in and was walking through our home while my family slept. Unaware, my bedroom back then was positioned at a corner of the house, right between the front entrance and the living room, which meant sound traveled straight to me from almost every direction. I heard everything that happened in that house during those early years, every creak, every footstep, every strange noise the place decided to make in the dead of night. And none of it ever stopped once it started, no matter how many nights passed. The footsteps never sounded rushed. That was somehow the worst part of it, the steadiness of them, the way they moved at an unhurried pace from one end of the house to the other, like whoever or whatever was making them had every right to be there and no reason at all to hurry. Sometimes they would stop right outside my door for a moment before continuing on, and I would lie there holding my breath, waiting to see if the handle would turn, if the door would creak open, if anything at all would happen beyond that brief pause. Nothing ever did. The footsteps would simply move on, fading back down the hallway toward the living room or the kitchen, leaving me wide awake and staring at the ceiling for the rest of the night. It seemed to get worse, if anything, once the upstairs construction finally finished and the whole household rearranged itself. I moved into what had been my brother's room. My brother took over what had been my parents' room, and my parents moved their things upstairs into the newly finished space. That put me directly underneath the living room, which had previously been the room stripped bare of its sheetrock, the same room the previous owner had torn apart in that strange fit of spite before leaving. I told myself for a while that the footsteps I kept hearing at night were just our dog wandering the house, restless the way dogs sometimes get, padding around from room to room while everyone else slept. That explanation worked for a while, right up until one night I actually snuck him into my room specifically to test the theory, curling up with him right there beside my bed where I could feel every twitch and movement he made, and I still woke up to the same footsteps sometime in the early hours, the dog sound asleep next to me the entire time, completely undisturbed by whatever was moving through the house. For a little while after that, things seemed to calm down. The footsteps grew less frequent, Or maybe I just got better at sleeping through them. I'm not entirely sure which. Either way, there was a stretch of relative peace in that house, long enough that I'd almost let my guard down completely. Right up until the night before, a trip my family had been looking forward to for months. I remember being excited about it. Remember going to bed that night already half, thinking about the trip instead of anything unsettling about the house, which somehow made what happened next feel even worse in contrast, like the house had waited for exactly the moment I'd stopped bracing myself for it. I woke up around 4 in the morning that night, the way I so often did in that place, except this time it wasn't footsteps that pulled me out of sleep. It was a hushed, hissing sound, low and steady, coming from somewhere in my room. My first instinct was to blame the aquarium sitting against my wall, telling myself the bubbler probably needed more water, that the pump was just working harder than usual against the lower water line, and I tried to settle back into sleep on that explanation alone. But the sound didn't fade the way a simple equipment issue should have. Instead, it got louder, and slowly, unmistakably, it stopped sounding like water and started sounding like something else entirely. I lay there for what felt like a long time trying to convince myself it was nothing, running through every mundane explanation I could think of. The filter, the heater cycling on, the dog shifting around somewhere out in the hallway. Each explanation felt a little thinner than the last, and none of them accounted for the way the sound kept shaping itself, kept rising and falling with a rhythm that machines simply don't have. Water doesn't pause. Water doesn't seem to catch its breath between sounds the way this was doing, almost like whatever was making it needed a moment to decide what to say next. I was picturing burglars again, the same fear that used to grip me those first years in the house, except now I was almost in 8th grade. Old enough that I decided, with all the confidence only a kid who has watched too much television can summon, that I should be brave about it, instead of hiding under my blankets like I used to. If there really were burglars somewhere in the house, I told myself I would rely on whatever hand-to-hand combat skills I had absorbed from years of watching Star Trek away missions, which in hindsight was not much of a plan at all, but it felt like enough courage to get me out of bed that night. I got up, opened my bedroom door, and stepped out into the hallway, moving as quietly as I possibly could, my bare feet barely making a sound against the floor. The noise got louder the closer I moved toward the living room. By the time I reached the edge of the hallway, it wasn't just a hiss anymore. It had shaped itself into something closer to whispering, hushed and urgent. Voices pitched low enough that I couldn't make out full sentences, but could catch pieces, scattered words drifting just clear enough to register before dissolving back into that same steady hiss. I heard something that sounded like she. I heard something that sounded like it. 2 voices, maybe more, carrying on some kind of hushed conversation from somewhere around the corner where the stairway leading up to my parents' room sat against the back wall of the living room. That stairway had originally had a proper door separating it from the living room, but at some point during renovations, that door had been taken out and replaced with an open arch instead, leaving the stairwell exposed to the rest of the room, dark and unobstructed, the perfect place for sound or anything else to gather and settle. Our dog was already awake by the time I stepped into the living room, lying on his bed near the couch, lifting his head the moment I appeared in the doorway. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just watched me with that same alert stillness dogs get when they sense something is different about the moment, even if they can't name what it is. I sat down on the couch as quietly as I could manage, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. Every bit of the courage I'd talked myself into on the way out of my room draining out of me with each second I sat there, listening. The whispering kept going. steady and low, just around that corner, close enough that I felt certain if I only looked, I would see exactly who or what was making it. Our dog got up from his bed and crossed the room to me, resting his head heavily on my lap, and I wrapped my arms around him and held on like he was the only solid thing keeping me in that room at all. I remember trying to focus on individual words, straining to pull something concrete out of that constant low murmur, and every time I almost caught a full sentence, it would slip away again, dissolving back into that same wet, hushed hiss before I could hold on to it. It didn't sound angry. That was almost worse somehow. It sounded conversational, unhurried, like two people discussing something ordinary in the next room over. Except there was no next room, just an open archway and a dark staircase and my own racing heartbeat drowning out everything except the parts of the whispering that were loud enough to cut through it. I don't know how long I sat there like that, frozen, listening to whispers I couldn't fully decode drifting from around a corner I was too afraid to look past. Eventually, though, something in me decided I couldn't keep sitting there forever, that I had to know, one way or another, what was making that sound. I got up from the couch, still holding on to the last scraps of the courage that had gotten me out of bed in the first place, and took the few steps across the living room toward the archway where the stairs began. My legs felt heavier with every step, like some part of my body already understood this wasn't a decision the rest of me should be making. I reached the arch, took one more breath, and turned the corner to look up the stairway. It was pitch black. And it was completely, entirely empty. I stood there for a long moment, just staring into that darkness, half expecting my eyes to adjust and reveal some shape I'd missed at first glance, a person pressed against the wall, a shadow that would resolve itself into something explainable if I just looked hard enough. Nothing resolved. The stairs simply climbed up into blackness and stopped. Empty, silent, giving nothing back to justify what I'd been listening to only seconds before. The moment I turned that corner, the whispering stopped. Not faded, not trailed off the way sound naturally does when a conversation winds down. It simply cut off, all at once, like someone somewhere had reached over and switched it off the instant I came into view. I stood there in that archway, staring up into a dark, silent stairwell that had, only seconds before, been full of hushed voices discussing something I couldn't quite make out, and now held nothing but shadow and stillness and the faint sound of my own breathing. I didn't go back to my room that night. I couldn't make myself do it. Couldn't make myself walk back down that hallway alone after what I just heard go silent right in front of me. Instead, I sat down at the top of the stairs, right where the whispering had been coming from, and I stayed there for the rest of the night, too scared to move and too proud to wake my parents up over something I already knew they'd struggle to believe. I sat there in the dark, listening to every sound the house made for the rest of those early morning hours, waiting for the whispering to start again, and it never did. My mother found me there the next morning, curled up at the top of the stairs, and I don't remember exactly what I told her, only that whatever I said wasn't the whole truth, because some part of me already understood that no explanation I could give would sound like anything other than a scared kid's imagination running wild. That house held on to plenty of other memories that never sat quite right with me either, even setting the whispering aside. There was a horse belonging to our neighbors, out in the field bordering our property, that died in a horrible, sudden way none of us ever got a clear explanation for, and the neighbor who owned it seemed to completely unravel afterward, in a way that went far beyond ordinary grief over losing an animal. The house next door to ours had its own reputation in the area, something of a running joke among the adults, always said with a strange edge underneath the humor, about how it seemed to break up every marriage that ever lived inside it. And further down, an old farmhouse from the 1800s sitting close enough to see from my bedroom window could never manage to keep tenants for more than a few months at a stretch before the place emptied out again, eventually sliding into full abandonment, boarded windows and all. The entire stretch of land out there seemed to carry something unsettled in it, like the strangeness of our own house was just one piece of something larger sitting over the whole area. I used to lie in bed some nights and try to map it all out in my head. That whole stretch of road with its dying horse, its marriage-breaking house, its farmhouse that ate through tenants like it had a quota to fill, and our own house sitting right in the middle of it with its footsteps and its shattering sounds that never left a single broken thing behind. None of it ever added up to anything I could point to as an explanation. No local legend or half-remembered tragedy that the adults would mention if you asked the right way. It just was what it was, an area that felt wrong in ways nobody could quite name, and we happened to live in the middle of it. There were other things, too, smaller things I only half remember clearly now, scattered across those years like pieces I never fit into any single story. I remember sneaking out a couple of times as a teenager, cutting through the backyard of that abandoned farmhouse to save time, only to notice afterward that I had faint finger-shaped bruises pressed into my arms and legs that I couldn't account for, bruises that hadn't been there before I crossed that yard. I remember standing alone in the dark, waiting for the school bus one morning and being growled at by something I never saw. A low, guttural sound close enough to feel aimed directly at me, telling me without words to leave. I remember my mother, on a separate occasion entirely from anything I witnessed myself, seeing a shadow move down our hallway and descend the stairs in the middle of the night, the same stairs that had once gone completely silent the moment I looked up into them. None of these things happened together, and none of them ever came with an explanation attached. They were just scattered across years of living in that house, spaced out enough that it was easy to convince myself each one was isolated, unrelated, nothing worth losing sleep over. It was only much later, once I was old enough to actually sit down and line them all up in my head, that I realized how many strange things had accumulated over the time we lived there, how much I'd quietly absorbed and filed away without ever really talking about it with anyone outside my immediate family. Out of everything that happened in that house over the years, the whispering is still the memory that unsettles me the most, even now, long after I moved out and built a life somewhere else. I think it's because it was the beginning, the moment that seemed to set the tone for everything strange that came after it. Once I'd heard those voices go quiet the instant I turned that corner, I never again fully trusted the silence of that house. Never again assumed that just because a room looked empty, it actually was. My parents still live there. They've stayed in that house for years since I moved out, and whenever I visit, I still find myself listening a little too closely to the quiet around that staircase, half expecting, even now, to hear that same low hiss start creeping back up out of the dark. I've asked my parents a handful of times over the years whether they've ever heard anything themselves, whether that staircase or that living room has ever given them a reason to pause the way it gave me one that night. They mostly brush the question off, tell me houses that old are always going to make strange noises, that wood settles and pipes groan and old wiring hums in ways that can sound like almost anything if you're tired enough or scared enough to fill in the gaps with your imagination. I used to accept that answer more easily than I do now. These days, when I visit and the house goes quiet around me late at night, I still find myself glancing toward that archway without meaning to, Still find some old, buried part of me bracing for a sound I haven't actually heard again in years, waiting to see if the dark up those stairs decides, someday, to start talking again. I spent so many nights at my grandmother's house when I was a kid that the place felt like a second home to me, maybe even more familiar than my own bedroom in some strange way. She lived in an old two-story house at the edge of town, the kind of house that creaked when the wind blew and smelled like cedar and old books no matter what room you walked into. My grandfather had built half the additions himself, back when he still had the strength for that kind of work, and every wall in that house seemed to carry some small piece of him in it. I loved staying there. At least I did until I turned 7, which was the same year he died. My grandfather had been the kind of man who was always doing something with his hands. Even when I was very small, before I understood anything about mortality or loss, I remember him out in the backyard fixing a fence post, or in the garage with sawdust coating his forearms, or up on a ladder clearing leaves out of the gutters, while my grandmother stood below telling him to be careful in that same worried tone she used for everything. He wasn't a big talker. He showed love the way a lot of men of his generation did, through fixing things, through building things, through making sure the house never fell apart around the people he cared about. When he died, it wasn't sudden. There had been months of hospital visits before that, months of my parents having quiet conversations in the kitchen that stopped the second my brother or I walked in, months of a slow unraveling that I was too young to fully track, but old enough to feel building in the background of every family gathering. By the time he actually passed, I think some small part of me had already been braced for it for a while. That didn't make it easier. It just made the house feel different, in a way I couldn't put into words when it finally happened. I don't remember much about the funeral itself. What I remember more clearly is the change that came over the house afterward, though I couldn't have explained it at the time. It wasn't that anything physically different happened. The furniture stayed where it always sat. The same photographs hung in the same crooked frames along the staircase wall. My grandmother still made the same breakfast every morning, still hummed old hymns under her breath while she washed dishes at the sink. But something about the air in that house had shifted, like a held breath that never quite let go. I started to feel it the moment I walked through the front door, a low, persistent hum of unease sitting right behind my ribs, and it never fully left me for as long as I was inside. It wasn't fear of anything specific. If you'd asked me back then what I was afraid of, I wouldn't have been able to give you an answer beyond a shrug and maybe tears if you pushed hard enough. It was more like a certainty, the kind that settles into a child's bones without any evidence to back it up, that something bad was going to happen in that house eventually. Not that night necessarily, not even that year, but someday, in some way, I couldn't picture. Something bad was waiting there for its moment. Kids get feelings like that sometimes, and adults wave them off as an overactive imagination, and maybe that's exactly what it was. I was, by every account from my parents, an anxious child. I want to be upfront about that, because it matters to the rest of what I'm about to tell you. Even with that heavy feeling following me from room to room, I kept staying over. My parents needed the break sometimes, and my grandmother loved having us, and my little brother didn't seem bothered by any of it the way I was, so there wasn't much reason for anyone to stop the visits. Most nights I managed to get through fine. I'd lie awake longer than I probably should have, listening to the house settle around me. But eventually I'd fall asleep and wake up to sunlight and the smell of bacon, and the dread would recede just enough that I could almost convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing the night before. I should mention something about myself as a kid, because it explains a lot of what happened that night. I had a habit, back at my own house, of waking up in the middle of the night almost every single night. It didn't seem to matter how tired I was when I went to bed or how uneventful the day had been. Something in me would surface out of sleep sometime after midnight, eyes open in the dark, heart already beating a little too fast before I even knew why. When that happened at home, I had a routine. I'd slip out of bed, pad down the hallway in my socked feet, and try the handle on my parents' bedroom door. Sometimes they'd let me crawl in with them. Other nights, when my dad was working early the next morning or my mom had a migraine, the answer was no, and I'd be sent back to my own room. On those nights, I wouldn't actually go back to bed right away. I would stand at the top of the staircase in the dark, gripping the railing, and stare down into the black well of the stairwell, absolutely convinced that if I watched long enough, I would see something start to move down there, or worse, start climbing up toward me. I never saw anything, but I stood there anyway, night after night, daring the dark to prove me right or wrong. I tell you all that so you understand this wasn't the first time in my life I'd had a strange nighttime encounter with fear that turned out to be nothing. I had a long history of watching shadows that never moved. That's important context, because for years afterward, my family used that history to explain away what happened at my grandmother's house. An anxious kid who already saw monsters in empty stairwells, they said. Of course she imagined something in a bedroom full of old dolls. It's a fair point. I've turned it over in my head more times than I can count. But I still don't believe it. Not even now. And I'm 22 years old and long past the age where children's night terrors are supposed to explain everything away. The night it happened, I was staying over with my younger brother, the two of us sharing what my grandmother called the spare room, though it had really become more of a storage space for keepsakes than an actual guest bedroom. It sat at the far end of the upstairs hallway, past the bathroom, past my grandparents' old bedroom that my grandmother still slept in alone. Its door usually left cracked open a few inches out of habit. The spare room had two twin beds pushed against opposite walls, mine along the wall closest to the door, my brother's against the far wall beneath the window. Between the beds, on the wall directly across from mine, sat a low wooden shelf that my grandmother had built up over decades, covered in a collection of dolls and handmade crafts that had been passed down or gifted to her over the years. Most of them were harmless-looking things, faded fabric animals, a few porcelain figures with chipped paint, a music box shaped like a carousel that hadn't worked in years. But the two dolls that always caught my eye, and not in a good way, were a matched pair sitting front and center on that shelf. A Raggedy Ann and a Raggedy Andy, propped up against each other like they were sharing some private joke. They'd been there for as long as I could remember, older than me by a wide margin, their yarn hair faded to a dull orange red, their painted smiles worn thin in places from decades of handling and sunlight. I never liked them. Even before my grandfather died, before that pervasive unease had settled into the house, I remember feeling a small flicker of discomfort whenever I looked at their painted button eyes, the way they seemed to stare at nothing and everything at once. I never told anyone that, because it felt like such a small, silly thing to be scared of. Dolls sitting on a shelf. What child hasn't felt that same crawling sensation at least once? Looking back now, I think I'd had smaller moments before that night. Little flickers I brushed off at the time without giving them much weight. There was one visit, maybe 6 months after the funeral, when I woke up in the middle of the night in that same spare room and could have sworn Raggedy Andy was facing the wrong direction, angled toward my bed instead of leaning against his sister the way he always did. I didn't investigate it. I just pulled the blanket up over my shoulder, told myself I'd misremembered which way he usually faced, and went back to sleep. There was another time when I woke up certain I'd heard the faint, off-key chime of that old broken carousel music box playing a few notes before going silent again. even though everyone in the family agreed it hadn't worked in years and nobody had touched it. Small things. Things I could talk myself out of in the daylight. I collected them without realizing I was collecting them. Little proof that something in that room wasn't quite as still as it looked, and none of them prepared me for what I saw the night I'm about to tell you about. That night started out the way most of my nights at my grandmother's house did. We went to bed at a reasonable hour after watching some show downstairs. My grandmother, tucking us both in with the same tired affection she always showed, telling us she loved us, reminding us the bathroom light worked with a pull string if we needed it in the dark. She left the hallway light on, a small courtesy she always extended without us having to ask, and closed our door most of the way, leaving that same familiar few inches of gap she always left. I remember lying there in the dark for a while, listening to my brother's breathing even out into sleep, far faster than mine ever did, staring up at the ceiling, and feeling that same low hum of dread I always felt in that house. The sense that I was waiting for something, without knowing what. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up, but it was deep enough into the night that the house had gone completely silent. The kind of silence that only exists in the hours when even the most restless sleepers have finally gone under. My internal clock, the same one that woke me up almost every night at home, did exactly what it always did. My eyes opened in the dark, and immediately I was awake, fully awake, heart already thudding in that particular way it does when your body senses something before your mind has caught up. I lay there for a minute just listening, the way I always did, trying to figure out if there was actually a reason I'd woken up or if it was just my usual pattern playing out again. The house was quiet. My brother was still breathing slow, and even in the bed across from me. Nothing seemed wrong. But the feeling wouldn't let go, and I knew from experience that I wasn't going to fall back asleep until I did something about it, so I decided to get up and see if my grandmother would let me come sit with her for a bit, or at least walk with me down to the bathroom, since the idea of going alone past that dark stairwell at the end of the hall was more than I could stomach that night. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake my brother, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold under my feet, even through my socks. I stood, and for a moment I just stood there in the dark room, letting my eyes adjust further, taking in the faint outline of the shelf across from me, the vague shapes of the dolls and crafts sitting where they always sat, unremarkable, unmoving, exactly as they should have been. I remember feeling almost embarrassed at myself in that moment, the same way I sometimes did at home when I'd wake my parents for nothing, when the dark turned out to be just dark after all. I turned toward the door, ready to make my way out into the hallway toward my grandmother's room, and that's when something made me look back one more time. I don't know what it was. Some instinct, maybe. The same one that used to keep me frozen at the top of my own staircase at home. Some part of my brain that refused to let me turn my back on a dark room without one last check. Whatever it was, I turned my head and looked back at that shelf, back at the two dolls sitting propped against each other in the dim light coming through the crack in the curtains. Raggedy Ann was waving at me. Her arm, the soft, floppy arm that should have been resting limp at her side the way it always had for as long as I'd known her, was raised, hand tilted slightly, moving back and forth in that same small motion you'd use to wave goodbye to someone from a car window. Her head was tilted with it, cocked to one side at an angle that felt deliberate, almost curious, like she was studying me, watching to see what I'd do now that I'd caught her moving. Her painted smile hadn't changed. It never could. But somehow, in that half second, staring at that unchanging painted grin tilted toward me, with her arm lifting and falling in a slow, unhurried wave, it felt like the most malicious expression I had ever seen on anything in my entire short life. I didn't scream. I want to be clear about that, because in the version of this story I've told a few times over the years, people always assume I must have screamed, must have woken the whole house with it. But I didn't. What actually happened was closer to my body, making the decision before my mind had fully processed what my eyes were seeing. I was simply moving, already through the door, already down the hallway, feet slapping against the hardwood floor faster than I think I had ever run in my life. And I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't so much as glance toward that dark stairwell I usually feared so much. Because in that moment, nothing in that entire house scared me more than what I'd just watched happen on that shelf. I left my brother there. I think about that more than almost anything else from that whole night. I didn't wake him, didn't grab him, didn't even think about him until I was already safely on the other side of my grandmother's door, with my hand still gripping the frame like it was the only solid thing left in the world. He stayed asleep the entire time, completely unaware, 6 feet away from whatever that doll had just done, and I left him there and ran. My grandmother's door was cracked open the same few inches it always was, and I pushed through it without knocking, without any hesitation at all, straight to the side of her bed. She woke up slowly, the way adults do when they're pulled up from deep sleep, blinking at me in the dark, asking what was wrong in that soft, groggy voice of hers. I told her. I don't remember the exact words I used, but I remember trying to explain that Raggedy Ann had waved at me, that her head had turned, that I needed her to come with me back to the room right now. My grandmother is, and always has been, one of the sweetest, most patient women I have ever known. She raised 5 children in that house, buried a husband in it, and never once in my life have I seen her lose her temper with a grandchild. But she is also deeply, stubbornly logical, the kind of woman who has never believed in anything she couldn't see with her own 2 eyes and hold in her own 2 hands. Even half asleep, even with me standing there clearly shaken, practically vibrating with fear in the dark of her bedroom, she told me it had been a dream. She told me dolls don't move, that I'd probably seen a shadow shift as my eyes adjusted, that I should go back to bed and let her sleep. She would not get up. She would not walk down the hall with me. She would not even really look at me with anything more than tired, gentle dismissal. I didn't go back to that room. I couldn't have. Not that night. Not for anything. Instead, I climbed into her bed, pulled the covers up over my head the way small children do when they think blankets can stop anything determined enough to come for them, and I stayed there curled against her back until I finally, eventually, fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. I don't remember dreaming. I don't remember waking up in the night again. When morning came, sunlight was pouring through her curtains, and for a moment I almost believed she'd been right, that it really had just been some trick of a tired, anxious mind. Then I went back down the hallway to get dressed, and I made myself look at that shelf one more time. Raggedy Ann was sitting exactly where she always sat. Her arm was down at her side, resting the way it had for years, her head straight, propped against Raggedy Andy, the same way it had been for as long as I could remember. Nothing about her had changed. There was no sign, no evidence, nothing that could have convinced anyone else in that house that anything unusual had happened at all. My brother, when I finally asked him about it years later, said he never woke up, never saw anything, never even remembered me leaving the room in the middle of the night. As far as he was concerned, it had been an uneventful sleepover like any other. For a long time after that night, I refused to sleep in that room at all, and my grandmother, despite never quite believing my version of events, never pushed me to go back to it either. For a while, she let me sleep on the pull-out couch downstairs instead, close to the kitchen, close to the front door, close to anywhere that wasn't that hallway. Eventually, as I got a little older and the shame of being scared started to outweigh the fear itself, I moved back upstairs, but always into my grandparents' old room with her. Never back into that spare room with the shelf. My brother, meanwhile, kept sleeping in there without a second thought, year after year, completely unbothered, and there were nights I lay awake down the hall, wondering if that meant something, wondering why whatever had happened only seemed to matter to me, and never to him. I'm 22 years old now, and it has been 14 years since that night. I still visit my grandmother's house regularly, still sleep in that same upstairs hallway sometimes when I stay over, though I haven't slept in that particular spare room again since I was old enough to request otherwise. That shelf is still there. Those same two dolls still sit on it, worn a little more with age now, their colors faded a shade further, but otherwise unchanged. Every single time I walk up that staircase, every time I pass that doorway, my eyes go straight to that shelf before I can stop them. Checking, always checking. The way you check a lock you already know is secured just to be sure. She has never moved again. Not once, not in 14 years, not on any of the countless nights I've spent under that roof since. I've watched her sometimes, standing in that doorway in broad daylight, staring at her for longer than is probably healthy, half daring her to prove me right and half praying she never will again. She never does. She just sits there, arm limp at her side, painted smile, fixed and empty. Exactly the same doll she was before that one impossible night. Exactly the same doll my grandmother insists I only dreamed up out of a child's overactive imagination. I want to believe them. I really do. It would be so much easier to file that whole night away as nothing more than a scared 7-year-old's mind playing tricks on her in the aftermath of losing someone she loved. My family has offered me that explanation so many times over the years that I could probably recite it in my sleep. An anxious kid who was already prone to imagining things in the dark, still grieving a grandfather she barely understood how to process. Staying in an unfamiliar bed surrounded by old, slightly unsettling dolls. Of course she saw something move. Of course she did. But I know what I saw. I was there. I watched that arm lift and fall in a slow, deliberate wave, watched that head tilt at an angle no doll should have been able to hold on its own, and no amount of time or logic or gentle family reassurance has ever managed to talk me out of that memory. Sometimes, on the nights when I can't sleep, when that same old childhood habit still creeps back into me even now as an adult and I find myself lying awake staring at nothing, I think about my grandfather, about how much of himself he put into that house over the years, about how the unease I felt there started the exact same year he died, and never really left as long as he was gone. I don't know what I believe happened that night. I don't think I ever will. Some part of me has made a kind of peace with never getting a clean answer. Because I've come to understand that not every strange thing that happens to a person gets explained, no matter how many years pass or how many times you replay it in your head, looking for the detail that will finally make sense of it. What I do know is that the feeling never really left me the way childhood fears are supposed to. I'm an adult now, old enough to know better, old enough to understand every rational explanation my family has ever offered me, and I still find myself glancing at that shelf every time I climb those stairs. Still find my pulse ticking up half a second before my eyes even land on it. Like some old animal part of my brain remembers exactly what it saw even after my conscious mind has spent 14 years trying to talk it out of believing. Sometimes I think about telling my own kids someday, if I ever have any, about that house and that room and that shelf. And I wonder whether I'll warn them the way no one ever really warned me, or whether I'll do exactly what my grandmother did and tell them it was nothing, just a bad dream, just a scared little girl imagining things in the dark. I honestly don't know which one I'd choose. All I know for certain is that somewhere in that old house, on a low wooden shelf at the end of a dark upstairs hallway, there is a doll that once waved at a frightened little girl in the middle of the night, and that I left my little brother sleeping 6 feet away from it and never looked back until morning came. When I was around 12 years old, I came home from school one afternoon to an empty house, which wasn't unusual for us back then. Both my parents worked full-time. My dad usually didn't get back until well after dark, and my mom's schedule kept her out most afternoons running errands or finishing up whatever project she had going that week. I was old enough by then that being home alone for a few hours didn't bother me much, and the only company I really needed was our golden doodle, Bentley, who followed me around the house the same way he always did, settling wherever I settled, content just to be near me. That afternoon, it was just the two of us in the house, the way it usually was on weekdays. Nothing about it feeling any different from 100 other afternoons before it. Our house had a finished basement that my parents had put a lot of work into over the years, turning it into a proper living space with a couch, a television, and enough room for me to set up my gaming console and lose entire afternoons down there without anyone bothering me. My dad had spent a whole summer a few years earlier laying carpet down there himself, hanging drywall, running new outlets so we'd have enough power for the television and the gaming setup without tripping a breaker every time we turned everything on at once. It had gone from a dusty, unfinished storage space to somewhere I actually wanted to spend time. Somewhere that felt like it belonged to me in a way the rest of the house, shared with my parents and their rules, never quite did. The basement had 2 separate entry points worth mentioning. There was the main staircase leading down from the first floor, which was the way I always went in and out, and then there was a large window near the back corner of the basement, tall enough and wide enough for a person to actually climb through if they needed to, fitted with a small ladder-like set of rungs built into the wall beneath it specifically so you could climb up and out in case of emergency. That window had always been there for as long as I could remember, part of the original design of the house. Meant more as a safety feature than anything anyone actually used on a regular basis. I remember my dad explaining it to me once, back when I was younger, telling me it was there in case of fire, so that anyone trapped in the basement would have a second way out besides the stairs. I never gave it much more thought than that after he explained it. It was just part of the room, the same way the couch or the television were, something I walked past every day without really seeing it anymore. The other detail about our basement that mattered that day was the double doors. Right at the bottom of the main staircase, before you actually stepped into the finished part of the basement itself, there were 2 doors that swung shut together, meeting in the middle with a very particular, very distinct sound whenever they closed. It wasn't a soft click or a quiet settling the way most interior doors sound when they shut on their own from a draft. These doors made a heavy, solid thud when they came together, loud enough to hear clearly from almost anywhere else in the house if you were paying attention. The kind of sound that was completely unmistakable once you'd heard it enough times to recognize it instantly. I'd grown up in that house long enough to know that sound better than almost any other sound the place made, the same way you learn to recognize a family member's footsteps or the particular creak of a specific stair. That afternoon, I'd gone down to the basement after getting home from school to play video games for a while before starting on homework, the same routine I followed most days. Bentley had come down with me at first, sniffing around the way he always did while I got settled in front of the television, but at some point he'd wandered back upstairs on his own. probably drawn by some sound from the first floor, or just following his own restless curiosity the way dogs do. I stayed down there playing for a good stretch of time, long enough to lose track of exactly how long I'd actually been in the basement, completely absorbed in whatever game I was working through that day. I remember being fully aware, at some point during that stretch of playing, that I had left the double doors open when I came down. I hadn't shut them behind me, hadn't even thought to, since there was never any real reason to close them when I was down there alone playing games in the afternoon. Eventually, I came back upstairs myself, leaving the game paused or saved, and settled onto the couch in the living room to watch some television instead, Bentley curling up next to me the way he usually did once we were both on the same floor of the house again. I don't remember exactly how much time passed after that, sitting there watching whatever show had caught my attention. But at some point, without any warning at all, I heard it. That unmistakable, heavy thud of the double doors slamming shut, echoing up from the basement, clear enough that there was no mistaking what it was or where it had come from. I sat there for a second, just processing what I'd heard, my mind immediately running through the obvious explanations before landing on the fact that none of them actually made sense. I was alone in the house except for Bentley, who was sitting right next to me on the couch, nowhere near the basement stairs, definitely not responsible for slamming a set of heavy double doors shut on his own. There was no draft strong enough in that house to do something like that, especially not to doors that heavy, doors that required real force to move at all, let alone force them shut hard enough to produce that specific loud thud I knew so well. And I knew for certain, without any doubt at all, that I had left those doors open when I came upstairs. I hadn't touched them. Nobody else was home to have touched them either. I remember sitting frozen on that couch for a solid minute after hearing that sound, my eyes fixed on the television, without actually processing anything happening on screen, my whole body straining to listen for any follow-up sound that might explain what I'd just heard. Nothing came. No footsteps, no further slamming, no creak of the stairs, just silence pressing back down over the house the same way it had been before, except now that silence felt different, felt like it was hiding something, instead of simply being empty the way it usually was when I was home alone. Bentley had lifted his head at the sound, too, ears perked, looking toward the hallway that led to the basement stairs with an alertness that did nothing to calm my nerves. Being the curious kind of kid I was, and maybe not fully appreciating yet just how unsettling the situation actually was, my first instinct wasn't to call anyone or lock myself in a room somewhere safe. My first instinct was that I needed to go find out what had actually happened, needed to see for myself what could have possibly caused those doors to slam shut on their own while I sat upstairs with the only other living creature in the house curled up right beside me. I got up from the couch, Bentley immediately alert and following along behind me, and made my way toward the top of the basement stairs. The staircase leading down to the basement was positioned so that you couldn't actually see the double doors until you'd rounded the corner at the bottom, meaning I had to commit to going down at least partway before I'd have any visual confirmation of what I already suspected. I crept toward the top of the stairs slowly, more cautious now than I had been walking through the living room a moment before, some part of my brain finally catching up to how strange the whole situation actually was. I leaned forward just enough to peer down around that corner without fully committing to descending the stairs yet. And there they were, the double doors, shut, completely, solidly shut. Exactly the way that Thud had suggested they would be, exactly the opposite of how I'd left them less than an hour earlier. That's the point where the fear really started setting in for me. Standing at the top of those stairs, staring down at two doors that had no business being closed, feeling the full weight of the situation finally settle over me the way it probably should have from the very first moment I heard that sound. But even with my heart pounding and every instinct telling me something was deeply wrong, I still wanted to know what had actually happened. I wasn't ready to just retreat to my room and pretend I hadn't heard anything, or call my parents and admit I was too scared to go check for myself. I needed to see it, needed to understand what could have possibly caused this, and looking back now as an adult, I recognize just how reckless that decision actually was for a 12-year-old home alone to make. So I did what felt, at the time, like the only logical response to the situation. I went and grabbed my airsoft gun. It wasn't a real weapon, obviously. Nothing that could have actually stopped anyone determined to do harm, but in that moment it felt like something. Some small measure of protection I could carry with me down those stairs, instead of going empty-handed into a basement that had somehow closed its own doors while I wasn't watching. I remember my hands shaking slightly as I checked that it was loaded. Some part of me embarrassed even in the moment at how seriously I was treating what should have logically been an easily explainable event. And another part of me completely unable to shake the growing certainty that something was actually genuinely wrong in my house. With the airsoft gun gripped in both hands, I started down the stairs, moving slowly, deliberately, testing my weight on each step before committing to it fully. The way you move when every part of your body is telling you to be as quiet as possible. Bentley came with me, staying close to my side the entire way down, and I remember being grateful for his presence in a way I hadn't fully appreciated before that moment. Some instinctive comfort in not being completely alone as I approached those closed doors. He didn't seem particularly agitated himself. No growling, no raised hackles. Nothing that would have suggested he sensed anything more threatening than usual, which in hindsight I've gone back and forth on interpreting as either reassuring or completely meaningless, since dogs don't always react the way you'd expect them to, even when something is genuinely wrong. I remember counting the steps in my head as I went, a habit I'd never noticed in myself before that day. Some part of my brain trying to anchor itself to something concrete and countable, while the rest of me was flooded with a fear I didn't fully know how to manage. We reached the bottom of the stairs together, the double doors standing directly in front of us now, shut tight exactly as they'd looked from the top of the staircase. I stood there for a moment, gathering whatever nerve I had left. Airsoft gun raised, heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my ears, and then I planted my foot and kicked the doors open as hard as I could manage. Some combination of fear and adrenaline pushing me to commit fully to the action, instead of slowly easing them open and giving whatever might be on the other side more time to react first. The doors swung open with a bang, and Bentley immediately shot past me into the basement, nose down, sniffing frantically at the floor and the furniture and every corner of the room, moving with the kind of focused energy dogs get when they're tracking something specific, something they can smell even if I couldn't see or hear anything myself. I stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like a long time, watching him move through the room, guns still raised, waiting for some sign, some indication of what exactly he was picking up on. My own senses straining to catch anything out of the ordinary in a room that otherwise looked exactly like it always did. After about 30 seconds of watching him circle the room without any sign of alarm, without stopping to bark or growl at anything specific, I finally started to relax slightly, telling myself that if there had been anyone actually in that basement, Bentley would have reacted more strongly than he was. I lowered the airsoft gun slightly and stepped into the room myself, still cautious, still scanning every corner as I moved further inside, my eyes adjusting to the dimmer basement lighting after coming from the brighter first floor. It was only once I was fully inside the room, past the couch and the television and the gaming setup I'd abandoned less than an hour earlier, that I noticed it. In the back corner of the basement, where that large window with the built-in ladder rungs sat set into the wall, the window was wide open, not cracked, not slightly ajar the way it might have been if it had simply come unlatched on its own. Fully open, pushed back as far as it could go, cool afternoon air drifting in through the gap and stirring the edges of a nearby blanket draped over the back of the couch. I stood there staring at that open window for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what I was looking at settle over me all at once. That window was never open. My parents kept it locked at all times, both as a safety measure and simply because there was no reason for it to be open on an ordinary day, no one ever using it as an actual entry point the way it had originally been designed for. I knew for certain it had been closed and locked that morning, the same way it always was. And now here, it stood open wide enough for a person to climb through with room to spare, the ladder rungs beneath it sitting right there, practical and functional. Exactly as they would need to be if someone had actually used them to climb down into my basement, or, just as easily, climb back out of it. Everything clicked into place at once. Standing there in that room with the airsoft gun still gripped tightly in my hands, and Bentley finally settling down beside me, his sniffing search apparently satisfied or exhausted, his tail giving one slow, uncertain wag, as if even he wasn't entirely sure what conclusion to draw from whatever he'd been smelling. Someone had been in my basement. Someone had come in through that window while I was down there playing video games. Or maybe while I was upstairs watching television afterward, close enough the entire time that they could have easily encountered me if our timing had lined up even slightly differently than it had. And at some point, for reasons I'll never fully understand, they had shut those double doors, whether by accident on their way past them or deliberately for some reason of their own, before making their way to that window and climbing back out into the yard. I didn't stay down there any longer than I had to after that realization hit me. I got Bentley and myself back up those stairs as fast as I could manage, locking whatever could be locked behind me, my hands fumbling slightly with the latches in my hurry, and immediately called my mom. I remember my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. The slammed doors, the open window, the fact that I'd actually gone down there myself with nothing but an airsoft gun for protection. And I remember the immediate shift in her tone the moment she understood what I was telling her. The calm, controlled panic of a parent trying not to alarm their child further while also trying to figure out the fastest way to get home. She called the police right after we hung up, and they arrived at the house not long after that, walking through the basement themselves, examining that open window, asking me detailed questions about exactly what I'd heard and when, what time I'd gone down to play games, how long I'd been upstairs before hearing the doors slam. They took the whole thing seriously in a way that somehow made everything feel even more real than it already had, confirming in their own careful, professional language what I'd already worked out on my own, standing in that basement, writing everything down in small notebooks, walking the perimeter of the house outside, checking the ground beneath that window for any footprints or disturbed dirt that might tell them more than what we already knew. Someone had almost certainly gotten into the house through that window, whether specifically targeting our home for some reason, or simply testing it opportunistically, while no adults appeared to be around. And the slamming doors had likely been either an accident on their way through, or possibly even a deliberate attempt to scare off whoever might be home, before they realized it was safer to leave the way they'd come than risk running into anyone directly. Nobody could say for certain exactly what the intent had been, Whether it was an attempted burglary interrupted by the sound of the television running upstairs, or something else entirely that none of us wanted to think too hard about. The police weren't able to find any fingerprints or other solid evidence out by that window or in the yard beneath it. Nothing conclusive enough to actually identify who had been there or why. All anyone could tell for certain was that a window that should have been locked had been opened from the inside at some point, and someone who wasn't me or my dog had very likely been standing in my basement while I was in the house, completely unaware of it. Close enough that a slightly different set of choices on either side could have meant an actual encounter instead of a closed door, an open window. My parents didn't waste any time after that. Within a week or two, they had a full security camera system installed around the exterior of the house, covering every entry point, including that basement window, along with new locks and additional latches on nearly every window on the ground floor. It became one of those defining moments in my childhood that quietly reshaped how our family thought about safety going forward. The kind of incident that gets brought up occasionally at family gatherings, even now, usually followed by my mom shaking her head at the memory of getting that phone call from a shaking 12-year-old telling her the basement doors had slammed shut on their own. I still think about that day sometimes, usually late at night when the house is quiet, and I catch myself listening a little too closely to ordinary sounds the way I used to as a kid, waiting to hear if anything sounds even slightly out of place. I think about how close the timing actually was that day. How I'd been down in that basement myself not long before hearing those doors slam. How easily things could have played out differently if I'd stayed down there a little longer, or come back down a little sooner. I think about Bentley, too, about how calm he'd actually been despite whatever he was smelling on that basement floor, and I've never quite decided whether that calmness meant whoever had been there was already long gone by the time we went down to check, or whether it just meant Bentley wasn't the reliable early warning system I'd always assumed a dog would be in a moment like that. To this day, we never found out who had actually been in the house that afternoon, or why they chose our home specifically, or what they might have been looking for, or whether they'd been watching the house beforehand and knew I'd be home alone that day. The cameras my parents installed afterward never turned up anything conclusive about that particular incident, since by the time they went in, whoever had been there was long gone. But they've given all of us a sense of security since then that the house simply didn't have before. I still walk past that basement window sometimes and think about that afternoon, about the ladder rungs built into the wall beneath it, about how easily accessible it had always been the entire time we lived there, without any of us ever really thinking about it as a vulnerability until the day someone else apparently did. My parents ended up talking to a few of the neighbors in the weeks after it happened, trying to find out if anyone else on the street had noticed anything unusual that day. A car parked somewhere it shouldn't have been. Someone walking around the neighborhood who didn't belong there. Anything at all that might help fill in the gaps the police investigation couldn't. Nobody had anything concrete to offer. One neighbor mentioned vaguely that she thought she might have seen someone walking along the tree line at the back of our properties sometime that week, but she couldn't say for certain which day, and it wasn't enough for the police to do much with beyond noting it in their report. That lack of any real answer has stuck with me over the years, almost as much as the incident itself. The way something that's significant, something that genuinely could have gone so differently, could just end without any real resolution, without a name or a face or a reason attached to it. Just an open window and a closed set of doors and a lot of unanswered questions that none of us have ever managed to fill in. Even now, years later, whenever I visit my parents and end up down in that basement for one reason or another, I catch myself glancing toward that window without really meaning to. Some old habit from that day that never fully faded even after all this time. The cameras are still there, small and unobtrusive, tucked into the corners of the house where you wouldn't notice them unless you already knew to look. A permanent reminder of a single afternoon that changed how my whole family thought about the safety of a house we'd lived in without a second thought for years before that. Bentley's gone now, too. Passed away a few years back from old age, but I still think about him standing there in that basement that day, sniffing around a room that had clearly just had a stranger in it, doing his best with whatever information his nose was giving him, even if it wasn't quite enough to have warned me before I'd already gone down those stairs myself with nothing but an airsoft gun, standing between me and whoever might still have been there. Back in high school, I used to hang out with my friend, who I'll call John here since I'd rather not use his real name, almost every single day. We were the kind of close that only really happens during those teenage years, spending afternoons and evenings at each other's houses, most often at his, playing video games or just sitting around talking about nothing in particular the way teenagers do when they have all the time in the world and none of the responsibilities yet to fill it with anything more urgent. His house became something of a second home to me during that stretch of my life. Familiar enough that I could navigate it without thinking. Comfortable enough that I never gave much thought to spending hours there almost every day of the week. His house itself was a fairly ordinary two-story place in an older part of town, the kind of house that had clearly been standing for decades before his family ever moved in, with the particular quirks and characteristics that older houses tend to accumulate over the years and never fully shake off. There was a finished basement where we spent most of our time together, a living room upstairs that connected to the kitchen, and a hallway leading back to the bedrooms that always seemed just slightly dimmer than the rest of the house, no matter what time of day it happened to be. I'd been in and out of that house so many times over the years that I could have navigated it blindfolded, every creak of the stairs and every quirk of the layout as familiar to me as my own home by that point. When we first started hanging out regularly at his house, I began noticing small things that I initially chalked up to nothing, the kind of minor oddities you talk yourself out of without much effort, because the alternative explanation feels too unlikely to seriously entertain. I would sometimes hear footsteps somewhere in the house when it was clear nobody else was around to be making them. Footsteps that had no obvious source, no explanation beyond an old house settling or some trick of sound traveling strangely through unfamiliar walls. Sometimes they came from directly above us when we were down in the basement. Other times from somewhere behind us when we sat in the living room, always positioned somewhere I couldn't easily explain away as something ordinary, like a pipe knocking, or a floorboard shifting under changing temperature. More often than the footsteps, though, I would catch what looked like the shadow of a person moving somewhere out of the corner of my eye, always in my peripheral vision, never directly in front of me, gone the instant I turned to actually look at whatever had caught my attention. I brushed all of it off for a long time, telling myself it was nothing more than an unfamiliar house playing tricks on senses that hadn't fully adjusted to its particular quirks yet. The kind of thing that probably happens in every house if you pay close enough attention. Shadows shifting with changing light, sounds carrying differently than you're used to from your own home. I didn't want to seem paranoid or overly dramatic about something that was probably completely explainable, so I kept it to myself for a while, quietly cataloging these small, strange moments without ever bringing them up to John directly. After about a month of this pattern continuing, of catching these shadowy glimpses often enough that I could no longer fully convince myself it was purely my imagination, I finally decided to mention it to him, expecting at most a mild acknowledgement or a shrug, maybe a joke about the house being old and creaky. Instead, his reaction caught me completely off guard. He got genuinely angry, more upset than the situation seemed to warrant, given how casually I'd brought it up, demanding to know who had told me that he'd seen what he called shadow people in that house, insisting I wasn't allowed to joke around with him about something like that. His voice had risen sharply, his whole demeanor shifting in a matter of seconds from the relaxed, easygoing friend I was used to into someone visibly rattled by what I'd assumed was an innocuous comment. I remember being taken aback by how seriously he was taking what I'd intended as a fairly offhand comment, and I quickly assured him that nobody had told me anything, that I hadn't heard this from anyone else at all, that I was simply describing something I had personally experienced myself, and had no idea he'd seen anything similar. That conversation seemed to open something up between us, some unspoken permission to actually discuss what neither of us had been willing to bring up before, and once we started comparing notes, it became clear that we'd both been quietly experiencing the same strange phenomena in that house for a while, without ever mentioning it to each other. Each of us privately convinced we were the only one noticing anything unusual at all. From that point forward, things seemed to escalate. Or maybe it was simply that we'd both started paying closer attention, no longer dismissing every small oddity as something explainable now that we understood we weren't alone in noticing them. We started hearing laughter at times when we knew for certain nobody else was home, faint but unmistakable, drifting from somewhere else in the house while the two of us sat together in whatever room we happened to be occupying at the time. It wasn't the kind of laughter you could easily explain away, not children playing outside or a television left on somewhere, but something closer, something that seemed to originate from inside the walls themselves, always just distant enough that we could never pinpoint exactly which room it was coming from. Doors would close on their own, firmly and deliberately, not the kind of soft drift you'd expect from an actual draft moving through the house, but a solid, purposeful closing that neither of us had touched. Sometimes loud enough to make us both jump, even after we'd started to expect this kind of thing to happen with some regularity. The television would turn itself on and off without either of us anywhere near the remote, sometimes flickering to a completely different channel than whatever had been playing before it shut off, as if something was actively interacting with it. Rather than the electronics simply malfunctioning on their own, the static burst of a suddenly changed channel, cutting through whatever conversation we'd been having at the time. Each of these incidents on its own might have been explainable. Old wiring, house settling, some environmental factor neither of us fully understood. But the accumulation of all of it together, happening with increasing frequency over the following weeks, made it harder and harder to maintain any comfortable denial about what was actually going on in that house. I remember the specific dread that started building in me every time I walked through his front door, a low-grade unease that never fully went away no matter how many times I told myself I was overreacting. A feeling that seemed to settle into my chest the moment I crossed the threshold, and didn't fully lift again until I was safely back outside. One day, after these experiences had grown noticeably more intense and more frequent than they'd been even a few weeks earlier, I mentioned to John, somewhat offhandedly, that maybe we should consider blessing the house, having someone come in to do some kind of cleansing or ritual to address whatever was going on. I hadn't fully thought through the suggestion before saying it out loud, more just voicing a thought that had been circling in my head for a while as things kept escalating around us. The moment those words left my mouth, a box sitting on a nearby kitchen counter launched itself directly at me, flying off that counter with enough force that it wasn't remotely possible to explain away, as it simply falling or sliding due to some ordinary vibration in the house. It didn't just tip over the edge and drop straight down the way gravity would have dictated if something had merely nudged it off balance. It flew, traveling several feet through the air in a trajectory that could only be described as thrown, straight at me, close enough that I had to jerk back to avoid it actually making contact. I know how unbelievable that sounds even now, retelling it years later, and I fully understand if anyone reading this assumes I must be exaggerating or misremembering the details somehow. But I promise you, standing there in that kitchen, watching that box come flying at me the instant I mentioned blessing the house, was without question the single most terrifying moment of my entire life up to that point, and honestly, still is even now, years removed from that afternoon. Both John and I were completely shaken after that. There was no more room left for denial or rationalization at that point. No way to convince ourselves any longer that we were simply misinterpreting ordinary house noises or letting our imaginations run away with us. Whatever was in that house had just responded directly, immediately, and violently to the specific suggestion that we might try to remove it. And that response left absolutely no doubt in either of our minds about what we were actually dealing with. I remember standing frozen in that kitchen for a long moment afterward, the box lying on the floor where it had landed, neither of us saying anything, both of us just staring at it, and then at each other, trying to process what had just happened right in front of us. We didn't waste any more time after that incident. We got holy water, and together we walked through every room of that house, sprinkling it while saying a prayer, doing our best to follow whatever guidance we could find or recall about how to properly bless a space experiencing that kind of activity. I remember how nervous we both were doing it, half expecting something else to happen in response, some further reaction from whatever had thrown that box at me only a short while before. We started in the basement, where we'd spent so much of our time together, working our way methodically up through the main floor and finally into the bedrooms upstairs, neither of us willing to skip a single room out of fear that leaving even one space untouched might allow whatever was there to simply retreat and wait us out. But nothing did happen. We finished walking through every room, said what felt like a final, sincere prayer together, standing in the living room where so much of the activity had seemed to center. And from that point forward, neither of us ever experienced anything unusual in that house again. The footsteps stopped. The shadows stopped appearing in our peripheral vision. The laughter, the doors, the television turning on and off, all of it simply ceased, as if whatever had been there had genuinely been affected by what we'd done, and had either left entirely or, at the very least, stopped making its presence known to us. For a good while after that, things felt completely normal again, and I started to actually relax during our time hanging out at his house. The constant low-grade tension I'd been carrying around finally easing off now that weeks had passed without a single incident to reignite it. We went back to our usual routine, spending hours in that basement the way we always had, and gradually the whole experience started to feel more like something that had happened to us, rather than something still actively happening around us. A chapter that had genuinely closed, rather than one we were still living through day to day. Months later, John came to stay with me at my family's lake house for a weekend, something we'd been planning for a while, looking forward to a couple of days away from everything else going on in our lives, just relaxing by the water and enjoying some time away from home. The lake house had been in my family for years, a modest single-story place set back a little from the shoreline, surrounded by tall trees that kept most of the property shaded even in the middle of summer. My family used it mostly on weekends and during the warmer months, and it had always felt like one of the more peaceful, uncomplicated places in my life, somewhere I associated purely with good memories and relaxation, rather than anything unsettling. Neither of us had any reason to expect that weekend to bring back any of what we'd already dealt with together in his house, and honestly, by that point, That whole experience felt like something we'd successfully moved past, a strange chapter that had closed with that blessing and never reopened since. At one point during the evening, both of us thought we caught sight of a shadow person. That same particular kind of shape we'd both grown so familiar with recognizing back at his house, moving somewhere at the edge of our vision inside the lake house. We looked at each other for a moment, both clearly having seen the same thing, both immediately thinking back to everything we'd experienced together months earlier. That same instinctive recognition passing between us, without either of us needing to say a single word about it out loud. But we decided, somewhat deliberately, to just pass it off as nothing. Maybe a trick of the lighting in an unfamiliar space. Maybe just our own minds primed to see something after everything we'd already been through together. Neither of us wanted to reopen that particular conversation if we didn't have to. Especially not on a weekend that was supposed to be relaxing and uneventful. Later that same night, well after we'd both gone to bed, we woke up to what sounded unmistakably like voices coming from the living room, clear enough to pull both of us out of sleep at nearly the same moment. John, thinking someone might have actually broken into the house, a much more mundane and in some ways more manageable fear than what either of us had silently been thinking about since that shadow sighting earlier in the evening, got up to go investigate. I stayed where I was, still trying to fully wake up, listening as he made his way down the hallway toward the living room to check on what was making that noise. A few moments after he left the room, I heard the sound of someone running, heavy, urgent footsteps thundering down the hallway at a full sprint, moving with a kind of desperate speed that immediately told me something had gone very wrong. The sound was unmistakable, close enough and loud enough that there was no mistaking it for anything else. Footsteps pounding against the hardwood floor of that hallway with real weight and urgency behind them. I got up and ran out of the room myself to see what had spooked John badly enough to send him running like that, fully expecting to find him somewhere close by, out of breath, ready to explain what he'd seen or heard in that living room, maybe collapsed against a wall, trying to catch his breath after whatever had scared him. He wasn't in the house at all. I searched the immediate area in a panic, calling his name, my own heart pounding now, with a fear that had nothing to do with an intruder and everything to do with the fact that I had clearly heard him running through that hallway only seconds earlier. And yet, he was nowhere to be found inside the house. I checked the living room, the kitchen, even glanced into the bathroom on the off chance he ducked in there for some reason, my voice getting more frantic each time I called his name without any response coming back. I finally found him outside, standing on the porch, looking just as shaken and confused as I felt. He explained that he had also heard a loud noise coming from inside the house, and had assumed, standing where he was in the living room, that the sound had actually been me, running toward him or making some kind of commotion elsewhere in the house. We stood there together on that porch for a long moment, trying to piece together what had actually happened. Both of us having heard the same kind of loud, running sound at roughly the same time. Both of us assuming it had been the other person, neither of us actually responsible for making it ourselves. Whatever had caused that sound, whatever had run down that hallway loud enough for both of us to hear it clearly from different parts of the house, it hadn't been either of us. And the realization of that settled over both of us slowly, standing out there in the cool night air with the lake stretching dark and quiet in front of us. Nothing else happened for the remainder of that weekend. We didn't discuss it much further once we were both back inside and had calmed down somewhat, both of us silently choosing to let the rest of the trip pass, without dwelling too heavily on what had happened, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe out of a shared unwillingness to fully confront what it might mean that whatever had followed us, or existed independently at that lake house. had made itself known in such an undeniable way. The next time I went back to the lake house myself, it had been sitting empty for about a week since that weekend with John, nobody having stayed there or even visited briefly in the interim. When I walked in, I found a picture frame that held a photo of me had been ripped clean off the wall it usually hung on and thrown down the length of the hallway, ending up far enough from its original spot that it clearly hadn't simply fallen due to some minor vibration or settling. The frame itself had cracked slightly on impact, the glass covering the photo spiderwebbed in one corner, lying face up on the hallway floor, as though it had been deliberately positioned there for me to find, rather than simply dropped in passing. And in the living room, the pillows from my couch, which normally sat spread out along its length the way pillows usually do, had been stacked one directly on top of the other, positioned with what looked like deliberate precision right in the exact center of the couch, arranged in a way that felt intentional rather than random or accidental in any sense I could explain. I stood there for a long time, just looking at both of those things. The torn-down photo of myself lying in the hallway and that precise, deliberate stack of pillows sitting in the middle of an otherwise empty couch in a house that had been completely unoccupied for a full week. Nobody had been inside that house during that time. No one had access to it besides my immediate family, and none of them had visited or mentioned doing anything to the living room or the hallway during that stretch. Whatever had done this had done it while the house sat entirely empty, with nobody there to witness it happening in real time the way we'd witnessed the box flying off that counter months earlier. I've since stopped hanging out with John altogether, for reasons that were mostly unrelated to any of this. Just the natural drift that happens between friends as people grow older and move in different directions after high school. New circles forming, new priorities taking over the time we used to spend together. But I've never experienced anything even remotely like what happened during that stretch of time. Not in his old house, not at the lake house, not anywhere else since. Whatever it was that we encountered together, whatever followed one or both of us to that lake house months after we thought we'd successfully dealt with it back at his place, it seems to have stayed behind, or moved on, or simply never crossed paths with me again in the years since, a strange and unresolved ending to a chapter that never really got the closure either of us wanted from it. I still think about that box flying off the counter more than almost anything else from that entire period. A specific, immediate, violent reaction to the exact words we'd chosen to say in that moment. As if whatever was listening in that house understood precisely what we were suggesting and wanted to make its objection unmistakably, forcefully clear before we could actually follow through on it. And I think about that photo of myself, torn down and thrown the length of a hallway in an empty house, and those pillows stacked with such deliberate care in the center of an otherwise undisturbed couch. Evidence of something that had clearly been present in a space where, by every reasonable measure, nobody should have been at all during that entire empty week. I don't know exactly what we encountered in either house, and I've never found a satisfying explanation that fully accounts for everything both John and I witnessed together during those months. From the earliest shadowy glimpses at the edge of our vision all the way through to that final unsettling discovery at the empty lake house. The ripped photo and the strangely stacked pillows waiting there for me after a week of nobody setting foot inside. What I do know is that I've never doubted, not for a single moment since it happened, that whatever we experienced together was real, undeniably real, in a way that has never required me to convince myself otherwise the way I sometimes had to during those first few weeks before I finally worked up the nerve to say something to John about what I'd been seeing, back when I still assumed I had to be imagining all of it on my own. Even now, years removed from all of it, I still find myself occasionally glancing toward the edges of a room out of old habit, some leftover instinct from that period, still checking for shadows that might be moving where they shouldn't be. Most of the time, there's nothing there at all, just an ordinary room doing exactly what ordinary rooms do. But every once in a while, in certain lighting, in certain unfamiliar spaces, I catch myself holding my breath for just a moment longer than necessary, waiting to see if anything moves. I've told this story to a small handful of people over the years, close friends and family members who I trusted enough to share it with. And reactions have varied widely. Some genuinely fascinated and eager to hear more detail, others visibly uncomfortable and quick to change the subject once I got to the part about the box flying off that counter toward me. I've never pushed anyone to believe me who wasn't inclined to on their own, and I've come to accept that not everyone will find it as easy to take at face value as I do, having actually lived through it myself alongside John from start to finish. But for the two of us who were actually there, who watched that box fly across a kitchen and later stood together on a dark porch, trying to figure out which one of us had made that running sound neither of us had actually made, there was never really any room left for doubt once it was all over and done with. I should mention before I even start that this whole thing happened in the house I actually live in now. The very same house that once belonged to my best friend's family before everything that follows drove them out of it for good. My computer desk sits right in front of the window today, and from where I'm sitting I can look directly across at the house where all of this originally began. My old childhood home now occupied by a different family entirely. That detail matters more than you might think once you hear the rest of the story. When I was about 13, I spent a huge amount of time at my best friend's house, which sat directly across the street from mine. It didn't really matter what time of day or night it was, because his stepmom and dad were excellent friends with my own dad, close enough that I could just walk over whenever I felt like it, without needing to call ahead or ask permission first. Most days after school, I'd wander across the street, play GameCube with him for hours, hang around doing whatever teenage boys do to pass the time, and then either head home whenever I got tired of it, or, just as often, end up spending the night there instead. It was an easy, comfortable friendship built on that kind of open-door arrangement between our two families, and neither of us thought twice about the back and forth between our houses. Our neighborhood back then was still a little rough around the edges, not fully developed, with empty lots scattered between the houses that were already built, and plenty of open space where new construction hadn't caught up yet. The dirt field between our two houses was one of those undeveloped patches, thick with weeds that came up almost to my knees in some spots, bordered by a wooden fence that separated it from the neighboring property. I'd walked across that field more times than I could count by that point, day and night, without ever giving it a second thought. Just another familiar stretch of ground on the short walk between my house and his. One particular night, sometime around 2 in the morning, I walked out of my front door to head over to his place the way I'd done 100 times before. Right outside my house sat a dirt field, mostly overgrown with weeds, the kind of empty lot that separated our two properties from the road and gave the whole area a slightly rougher, undeveloped feel compared to the rest of the neighborhood. I started walking across it the same way I always did, and almost immediately I felt a sudden chill run through me, goosebumps rising up my arms even though the night wasn't particularly cold. I didn't think much of it at first, just kept walking, chalking it up to nothing more than a passing gust of wind or some ordinary shift in temperature. The kind of small physical sensation you barely register on an ordinary night when nothing else has given you any reason to be on edge. The night was quiet in the way small neighborhoods tend to be at 2 in the morning. No traffic, no other people out, just the occasional, distant bark of a dog somewhere down the street, and the soft rustle of weeds brushing against my legs as I walked. I remember the moon was out that night, bright enough to see reasonably well without needing a flashlight, which made what happened next even harder to explain away as some trick of poor lighting or an overactive imagination working in near total darkness. After about 20 steps or so, I glanced over toward the field and saw the silhouette of a person standing there, leaning against my neighbor's fence in a way that immediately put me on edge. I got nervous fast, my heart picking up pace, and I tried to act like I hadn't noticed anything, keeping my eyes forward and my pace steady even as every instinct in me screamed that something wasn't right. I told myself it was probably just someone from the neighborhood out for a late walk. Someone with a perfectly ordinary reason to be standing near that fence at 2 in the morning, even though nothing about that explanation actually felt convincing to me at the time. After maybe another 10 feet of walking, I looked over again, and this time the silhouette had changed. It was glowing now, a bright white light outlining the same human-like shape that had been leaning against that fence only moments earlier. I don't fully understand what happened next, but something about that glow seemed to pull me toward it. Some force I couldn't explain or resist, strong enough that I actually changed the direction I was walking and started heading straight toward it instead of continuing on my usual path toward my friend's house. I made it maybe 15 feet closer before I heard a deep, terrifying laugh rumble out from wherever that glowing shape stood, and at the exact same moment, the silhouette began to change shape right in front of me. I swear on everything I have that the sound of that laugh snapped me out of whatever trance had been pulling me toward it, and the moment I came back to myself, I saw clearly that what looked like horns were now protruding from the top of its head. That sound alone was enough to break whatever hold it had been exerting over me. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than any human chest could produce, echoing across that empty field in a way that made every hair on my body stand up at once. I started to panic immediately, tears already forming from pure terror, and I broke into a full sprint toward my friend's house, no longer caring at all about maintaining any kind of composure. My legs felt heavier than they should have, weighed down by fear in a way that made every stride feel like it was taking twice as much effort as it should have. My breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps as I pushed myself to run faster than I think I ever had before in my entire life. Within about 2 seconds of running, I could hear something behind me, footsteps or some kind of movement that sounded exactly like it was chasing me, close enough that the sound seemed to be gaining on me with every stride. When I turned to look, though, there was nothing there. The field behind me completely empty as far as I could tell in the dark. Nothing but weeds swaying gently in the night air and the empty stretch of ground I'd just crossed. But when I turned back around to keep running, the same silhouette was now standing directly in front of my friend's house, staring intently into his bedroom window, making that same deep, terrifying laugh I'd heard only seconds earlier out in the field. Its impossible speed in getting there ahead of me somehow just as frightening as anything else that had happened so far. I had no idea what to do at that point. Completely lost, running on pure adrenaline and fear. I sprinted toward his parents' car, which was parked in the driveway, because I knew they kept a garage door opener tucked under the seat, something I never fully understood the reasoning behind, but had noticed before during previous visits, a small, strange detail that suddenly felt like the most important piece of information I had ever learned. I yanked the car door open, grabbed the opener, and hit the button to start the garage door rising, my hands shaking so badly I nearly fumbled it in the process. As I tried to slip underneath it while it was still opening, not wanting to waste even the few extra seconds it would take to open all the way, I heard panting and footsteps closing in behind me, getting closer with every passing moment. Close enough now that I could almost feel the presence of whatever it was directly at my back. Right as I was trying to duck under that rising door, something grabbed me, or at least it felt exactly like something had. A solid physical grip closing around me from behind, fingers or something like fingers pressing hard enough into my shoulder that I could feel it even through the panic flooding every part of my body. I started screaming immediately, genuinely convinced in that moment that I was about to die. That whatever had been chasing me through that field and standing outside my friend's window had finally caught up to me. That whatever grip had closed around me was about to pull me back out into the dark, where I would never be found again. About 2 seconds after that grip closed around me, a bright flash of light lit up the area, and I swear I saw what looked like an angel standing in the empty lot right next to my house, illuminated in that sudden burst of brightness. A figure so different in feeling from everything else I'd just experienced that it almost didn't register as real at first. Somehow, in the middle of all that terror, I managed to scramble to my feet as fast as I possibly could and slam the garage door button again to close it behind me. But the silhouette of what appeared to be that angel, standing there in my lot, suddenly filled me with an overwhelming sense of calm, a feeling completely at odds with everything I had just experienced only seconds before. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, trying to process the sudden shift from pure terror to unexpected peace, before finally making my way inside to find my friend. When I told him everything that had happened, I fully expected him to laugh it off, call me a liar, or at the very least tell me I was being ridiculous for thinking I'd actually seen any of it. I remember standing there in his room, still shaking, my words tumbling out faster than I could properly organize them, trying to explain a night that made almost no sense even to me as I described it out loud. Instead, he told me something that completely changed the direction of that entire conversation. He said he'd been seeing things he couldn't explain for a while now, both in the empty lot next to my house and right outside his own bedroom window, and that whenever he saw them, his strategy had always been to simply not move, to close his eyes and wait it out until whatever it was eventually left. The description he gave me of what he'd been seeing matched exactly what I had just experienced myself out in that field and standing outside his window, right down to the same glowing outline and the same sense of being watched by something that clearly knew it was being observed in return. Hearing him describe it so precisely, using almost the same words I would have used myself, was somehow both a relief and a fresh wave of fear all at once. A relief because it meant I wasn't losing my mind, that someone else had genuinely experienced something similar enough to recognize exactly what I was describing without me needing to spell out every detail. And a fresh wave of fear, because it meant this wasn't some one-time fluke tied specifically to me, but something that had apparently been present around his house, and by extension, around mine, for a much longer stretch of time than either of us had previously realized. Not even 2 hours later, while we were sitting together watching a movie trying to calm our nerves down after everything that had already happened that night, we heard a scratching sound coming from directly behind us. We both turned around at the same time and saw a silhouette standing there, and I immediately recognized it as the exact same shape I'd seen outside his window earlier and in the lot next to my own house. He said instantly, in a low, urgent voice, "Dude, don't move." And I trusted him completely, staying frozen in place while I whispered back to him that this was exactly what I had seen earlier that night. He whispered back that this was the same thing he'd been seeing for months now, confirming that whatever this was had apparently been present in his life long before I'd ever encountered it myself. After about a minute of neither of us moving, both of us just staring back at that silhouette while it stared back at us, it suddenly banged hard against the glass window behind it, and we both completely lost it, bolting from the room and running straight into his living room, absolutely terrified and unsure of what to do next. My friend started crying at that point, genuinely convinced that whatever this thing was had come specifically for the two of us, that we were both about to die right there in his house. I remember his voice cracking as he tried to speak, half-formed words about not wanting to die, about wishing we'd never gone into that room together at all, panic overtaking any ability either of us had to think clearly about what to actually do. And then, without warning, the same silhouette appeared again, this time standing in the hallway that led directly into the living room where we were hiding. Neither of us said a word for a moment, just staring at each other, and then back at that dark shape blocking the only real path out of the room we were in, both of us fully convinced now that there was nowhere left to run to. We both started screaming and yelling for his parents at the top of our lungs, scrambling toward the couch and pulling the blankets over ourselves in some instinctive, useless attempt to hide from whatever was standing in that hallway, watching us. The same kind of childish logic that makes a blanket feel like protection, even when some part of your brain already knows it isn't. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about a minute of us crying and completely losing our composure, his dad finally walked out of his bedroom to see what all the commotion was about, telling us it was almost 5 in the morning and asking why we were making such a racket. We tried to explain everything that had happened, as coherently as two terrified 13-year-olds could manage at that hour, and he simply told us it was our imaginations running wild. Nothing more than that, before sending us back to bed. About a month after that entire night, my friend called me around 2 in the morning again, and this time he told me he could see a lot of black shapes walking around outside my house. His voice on the phone sounded exactly like it had that first terrifying night, tight and fast, the kind of voice people get when fear has completely taken over their ability to stay calm. I immediately woke up my dad and told him someone was outside, and he went out to check but found absolutely nothing there, walking the perimeter of the house with a flashlight while I stood at the door watching, my friend still on the line the entire time. When I went back to my own room afterward, I looked out my window and saw two silhouettes standing right outside, close enough to see clearly even in the dark, motionless, just standing there in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. I decided at that point that there was no way I was staying in my own room that night, and instead went to sleep in my brother's room, too scared to be alone with that image still fresh in my mind. I realized partway through all of this that my friend was still on the phone the entire time I'd been talking to my dad, and when I went back to pick it up again, I could hear him screaming for his parents on the other end, his voice muffled and distant like he'd dropped the phone somewhere and was too panicked to pick it back up properly. He finally picked up and said to me, in a voice shaking with fear, "Dude, I think they're in my house." Only a few seconds after that, I heard loud banging on his bedroom door through the phone, and he began screaming louder and louder, the sound genuinely terrifying to listen to even from a distance. Each thud against that door sending a fresh jolt of fear through me even though I was sitting safely in a completely different house. After about 2 minutes of that banging continuing, his parents finally came into his room and asked if he was okay. A week later, his family moved out of that house entirely, without ever giving a clear explanation as to why, at least not one that filtered down to either of us kids at the time, though I would eventually come to understand at least part of it years later. My friend and I are still best friends to this day, And for a long time afterward, I kept asking him to tell me exactly what had happened that final night before they moved. But he wouldn't say much about it, always deflecting or changing the subject whenever I brought it up. That continued for a long time, right up until about 2 months ago, when I finally told him that I had started seeing the same silhouettes again myself. This time outside of my own house, standing near the same field where everything between us had first begun all those years back. I should probably explain here that my family actually ended up moving into that same house his family had left about a month and a half after they moved out. It was a bigger house than the one I'd grown up in, and it happened to be on the market for a good price around the same time my family was looking to move. My dad essentially gave me that house as a gift about a year ago, telling me it was mine to take care of as long as I kept up with it properly, which is part of why I now live directly across from my old childhood home, close enough to see it clearly from my own window whenever I sit down at my computer. After I told my friend about seeing those silhouettes again, this time from inside the very house he'd once lived in and eventually fled from, he told me exactly what had happened during that final period before his family left. Details he'd apparently been holding back from me all this time, whether out of embarrassment or genuine fear of reliving it, by putting it into words for someone else to hear. He said that if things ever got worse for me the way they had for him, I needed to actually do something about it, rather than just trying to wait it out the way we had as kids. He told me that there had been black outlines of people surrounding the house constantly during those final weeks, visible almost every night by that point, and that both his mother and father had actually known about what was happening the entire time, but had chosen not to tell him directly, not wanting to scare him any more than he already was. He described a specific, horrifying sensation, a feeling like someone was standing directly on his shoulder while he lay in bed, and something else gripping his feet, almost as if it were trying to drag him down through the floor itself. He said his parents had come rushing in during one of these episodes, and the moment they entered the room, everything simply stopped, as suddenly and completely as it had started, leaving no trace behind except the memory of what had just happened to him. That's the whole story, as much of it as I can piece together between what I personally experienced and what my friend eventually told me once I'd finally shared enough of my own experiences to make him feel comfortable opening up about his. All these years after it first began between two families living directly across the street from each other. To this day, I still occasionally catch sight of some kind of silhouette, whether around my own house or somewhere nearby, and I honestly don't know anymore whether it's something genuinely still out there or just my own mind playing tricks on me after everything I've been through. Either way, it still scares me every single time it happens, without fail. I have no real idea what it was that we saw that night all those years ago, or what continued happening to my friend and his family in the months that followed, or what I myself have apparently started experiencing again now that I live in that same house across the street from where I originally grew up. I've tried researching it extensively since then, looking for anything online or in books that might describe something similar, any account from anyone else that might match what we went through, and I've never found a single thing that comes close to explaining it. But I wanted to share what happened anyway, exactly as I remember it, in case it means something to someone else out there who might have gone through something similar themselves in their own neighborhood, their own field, their own empty lot late at night. Sometimes late at night, sitting here at my computer with that old house visible right across the street, I find myself thinking back to that first night in the field. The glowing silhouette, the deep laugh, the horns, the flash of light that I still believe was some kind of angel standing in that empty lot beside me. I think about my friend crying on the couch, convinced we were both going to die, and about the phone call a month later where I could hear him screaming while something banged on his bedroom door. I think about the fact that I now live in that exact house, sleeping in rooms where whatever had been tormenting him used to walk, and I wonder sometimes whether moving in there was really as simple a decision as it seemed at the time, or whether something about that house had actually wanted us there all along, waiting patiently for one family to leave so another could take their place. I've talked to my friend about it more than once since he finally opened up to me, both of us circling back around to the same unanswered questions every time. Neither of us has ever managed to land on any kind of satisfying explanation, and honestly, at this point, I'm not sure either of us actually expects to. What we've settled into instead is a quiet, mutual understanding. Two people who watched the same impossible things happen years apart in the same small stretch of neighborhood, who trust each other completely, even when nobody else in either of our families ever really wanted to talk about it directly. I still keep my curtains drawn most nights now, more out of habit than anything else. And I still catch myself glancing toward that empty lot every so often when I walk out my front door after dark, half expecting, even now, to see that same glowing shape leaning against the fence the way it did all those years ago. This story belongs to my dad. It happened back when he was 17 years old, living out on an isolated farm in Nebraska. And even now, all these years later, he still tells it the same exact way every single time, which is part of what makes it stick with me so much whenever I think back on it. The farm sat well out past the edge of town, far enough from any other house that true isolation wasn't just a phrase used to describe the place. It was simply the reality of living there day to day. Flat farmland stretched out in every direction for as far as the eye could see, broken up only by an occasional line of trees marking where one property ended and another began, or a distant grain silo standing alone against the wide open sky. The nearest neighbor lived far enough away that you couldn't see their porch light glowing at night at all, let alone hear a car in their driveway or a dog barking in their yard, no matter how quiet and still the night happened to be that particular week. The house itself was an old farmhouse that had been standing on that land through multiple generations of my dad's family, weathered by decades of brutal Nebraska winters and equally brutal summer heat. The kind of house that had settled deep into its foundation over the years and developed all the particular creaks, groans, and small idiosyncrasies that old houses like that tend to accumulate. My grandfather had grown up in that same house before my dad ever did, and his own father before him, the property passing down through the family, generation after generation, by the time my dad was living there as a teenager. It had been added onto and repaired countless times over the decades. A porch built on at some point, a section of roof redone after a bad winter storm had damaged it badly, plumbing updated here and there in pieces rather than all at once, leaving the whole place with a patchwork feel of old sections sitting right alongside slightly newer ones throughout the house. My dad has told me before that the place always made its fair share of noise after dark. Wind pushing through old window frames, pipes groaning as the temperature dropped once the sun went down, the ordinary background chorus that any farmhouse of that age tends to produce once everyone inside has finally gone still. On the night this story centers around, my dad was home entirely by himself. His parents had gone somewhere, though the details of exactly where or for how long were never really the important part of the story, just a necessary bit of context explaining why a 17-year-old boy found himself completely alone in such a remote place for the entire night. He went to bed at a fairly ordinary hour, nothing unusual standing out about the evening that led up to it. No particular sign that anything out of the ordinary might be waiting for him once he finally closed his eyes and let sleep take over for the night ahead. He ended up having a string of bad dreams that night, one bleeding into another, the kind of restless, uneasy sleep where you drift in and out repeatedly, without ever settling fully into anything deep or peaceful, waking briefly between each one only to slip back under a few minutes later. Most of those individual dreams have faded from his memory in the years since, the way dreams typically do, dissolving down into vague fragments, rather than anything he could still describe with real detail today. But there was one dream in particular from that night that he still remembers with startling clarity even now, decades later. One he's described to me the same exact way every single time he's brought this story up over the years. In that specific dream, he was lying in his room, in the exact same bed he was actually sleeping in that night, surrounded by the exact same walls and furniture he'd known his entire life up to that point. The details matched his real room so precisely, right down to the position of the window and the particular shape of moonlight falling across the floor, that he's told me more than once this is part of what made the whole experience feel so seamless, so difficult to separate from waking reality even well after he'd already come fully awake. He heard footsteps out in the hallway, approaching his bedroom door slowly and deliberately, the kind of unhurried pace that suggested whoever, or whatever, was making them had absolutely no reason to rush, no fear at all of being heard along the way. He lay there in the dream, listening to those footsteps grow steadily closer, one after another, each one landing with the same measured weight as the last, until they finally reached his door and came to a complete stop directly outside it. And then there was nothing. No further movement. No additional sound. Just heavy silence pressing in around that closed door for what felt, even within the confines of the dream itself, like an unusually long and tense stretch of time. He's described that particular pause to me as somehow being the worst part of the whole dream, worse even than watching the door eventually open. That stretch of complete stillness, where he lay there fully aware that something was standing right on the other side of a thin wooden door, giving absolutely no indication of what it intended to do next. A few seconds later, the door slowly began to open, swinging inward with a kind of unhurried, deliberate motion that somehow made the whole moment feel even more dreadful than if it had simply burst open all at once without warning, the hinges making no sound whatsoever in the dream, which somehow made the entire scene feel even more wrong than if it had creaked the way an old farmhouse door normally would. That's more or less where the clearest part of the dream ended, because the next thing he was consciously aware of was waking up with a start, his heart absolutely hammering in his chest, beating so fast and hard that he could feel it thudding in his throat as well. It was right around 1 in the morning when he woke, the house completely dark and silent around him, wrapped in that particular kind of deep rural quiet that simply doesn't exist anywhere near a town, let alone in a city, a silence so total it almost had a physical weight to it. No distant traffic, no neighbor's dog, nothing but the vast emptiness of open fields stretching out for miles in every direction around him. He lay there for a moment, just catching his breath, staring up at the dark ceiling above him, trying to slow his racing pulse down enough to think clearly about anything at all. He's described that first moment of coming awake as disorienting, in a way that went well beyond an ordinary nightmare. A lingering confusion about whether he was actually fully awake yet, or still somehow caught inside the dream. A feeling that took several seconds longer than usual to fully shake off before his mind caught up with his body. He looked around his darkened room for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, needing to confirm for himself that everything really was exactly as it should be. He felt a wave of relief wash over him once he saw that he was still completely alone, still safely tucked into his own bed in his own familiar room, and that his bedroom door, the very same door that had slowly swung open in his dream only moments earlier, remained firmly shut exactly the way he had left it before falling asleep in the first place. He let out a long, slow breath, telling himself firmly that it had only been a dream, an unusually vivid and unsettling one for sure, but nothing more serious than that. The kind of nightmare that feels completely real while you're caught up in it, but loses its grip almost instantly once you're fully awake and can see with your own eyes that nothing is actually wrong. He's mentioned before that he actually let out a short, nervous laugh at himself in that moment, more of a shaky exhale than any real amusement, feeling slightly embarrassed, even alone in the dark, at how badly a simple bad dream had managed to rattle him, telling himself he was far too old to still be shaken awake by something as ordinary as a nightmare about a door. He started to relax again after that initial jolt, settling back down against his pillow, preparing to close his eyes and try to drift back off despite how shaken the dream had left him. And then he heard it. A distinct creak, unmistakable, coming directly from the area of his bedroom door. He looked over immediately, his entire body tensing up all at once, and watched, frozen, as that same real, physical door in his real waking bedroom began to open on its own, moving with that same slow, deliberate motion he had just watched play out only seconds earlier inside his own dream, as though the sequence had never actually stopped when he woke up at all, simply carrying straight through into waking life without any real interruption. He didn't stick around to see how far it would swing open or to find out what exactly might be standing on the other side of it. He screamed, loud enough that he later described it as screaming absolute bloody murder, an instinctive, full-throated scream that tore out of him before he'd even consciously decided to make a sound. And then he charged straight across the room at that door, slamming it shut with every bit of force his 17-year-old body could throw behind it, pressing his shoulder hard against the wood afterward and holding it there, chest heaving, half expecting to feel something pushed back from the other side at any moment. He's told me he stayed braced against that door for what felt like a full minute, waiting for some kind of pressure or resistance from the other side that would confirm his worst fear, that something had actually been standing right there in the hallway, only inches away from him. Nothing did push back. The door held firm and stayed shut. But he wasn't about to trust that sudden stillness, not after everything that had just happened in the span of only a few short minutes. He turned on every single light he could reach throughout the entire house, moving quickly from room to room, flipping switch after switch, chasing back every last shadow he could find, as if flooding the place with enough light might somehow undo whatever it was that had just happened in his own bedroom. He moved down the hallway first, hitting every switch along the way, then down the stairs, the house steadily filling with light behind him as he went, each room lit up in turn until the entire downstairs blazed as bright as the middle of the day, despite it still being well past 1 in the morning. He made his way downstairs and stayed there, wide awake, sitting alone in a house lit up as bright as daylight, refusing outright to go back upstairs or shut off a single light, and he remained down there until someone else finally came home, and he no longer had to sit through the rest of that long night completely by himself. He's described sitting at the kitchen table during those remaining hours, every light in the house switched on, listening carefully to every small sound the house made. The ordinary settling and creaking he'd never paid much attention to before that night, suddenly sounding far more sinister than it ever had. Each little noise making him tense up all over again, despite knowing full well that houses simply make sounds as the temperature shifts overnight. He kept glancing toward the staircase every so often, half expecting to see something standing up there looking down at him, though nothing ever did appear for the rest of that long, sleepless stretch of night. He's told me he honestly doesn't remember exactly how many hours passed before someone finally did make it home. Whether it was closer to dawn or still solidly in the dead of night, only that it felt like an absolute eternity sitting there by himself with every light burning. Too afraid to move much beyond occasionally getting up to double-check that the front door was properly locked, pacing between the kitchen and the front window every so often, just to have something to do with all that restless, leftover energy still running through him. When headlights finally swept across the kitchen window, signaling someone pulling into the driveway at last, he said the flood of relief that washed over him in that instant was almost as intense as the fear had been only hours before. A complete wave of relief at no longer being the only living thing left in that house. He's told me over the years, more than once, that this remains one of the single scariest things that has ever happened to him across his entire life, which genuinely says quite a lot given everything else he's actually lived through in the decades since then. He's mentioned, almost in passing, whenever this story comes up, that the only other experience that has ever come close to matching that particular level of fear was a time much later in his life when he found himself trapped inside an abandoned building during an actual bombing, fully believing in that moment that he was about to die. He rarely elaborates much further on that second incident whenever it gets brought up, usually just referencing it briefly as a point of comparison before moving the conversation right back to the farmhouse story, which he seems, if anything, far more willing to revisit and discuss in detail, almost as though that particular memory, unsettling as it is, has become somehow easier for him to sit with over the years than the more objectively dangerous one. The fact that he places a childhood nightmare and a slowly opening bedroom door on almost the exact same level of sheer terror as surviving an actual bombing tells you something important about just how deeply that one particular night affected him, how completely it lodged itself into his memory as an experience that, even now, after everything else, still ranks among the most frightening things he has ever personally lived through. I've asked him more than once over the years whether he ever managed to come up with any kind of rational explanation for what actually happened that night. Whether it might simply have been an old farmhouse door with a loose or worn-out latch that happened to swing open at exactly the worst possible moment, right on the heels of a dream that had just shown him nearly the identical thing happening only seconds before. He's never really had a fully satisfying answer to give me, no matter how many times I've brought it up over the years, hoping maybe this time he'd have landed on something more concrete. He's willing to acknowledge, the way any reasonable adult eventually does when looking back at a childhood fear with some added perspective, that there could well be a mundane, ordinary explanation buried somewhere in the mechanics of an old door inside an old house, warped wood over the years, a latch that had simply never quite sat right. Some draft strong enough under just the right conditions to nudge it open on its own, air pressure shifting as the furnace kicked on somewhere deep in the house. But he's also always quick to point out that the exact timing of it all, waking abruptly from that particular dream, only to watch the same sequence begin unfolding again in reality mere seconds afterward, has never once sat comfortably with him as something purely coincidental. No matter how many times he's genuinely tried to talk himself into accepting that explanation over the years since. My dad has never really been the type of person who puts much stock in anything supernatural. He's always been a practical, grounded kind of man. Someone who has spent the majority of his life dealing directly in concrete, physical realities, farm machinery, weather patterns, the kind of demanding hands-on work that doesn't leave a lot of natural room for entertaining ghost stories or unexplained phenomena as anything more than casual entertainment. He's never been someone who reads deep meaning into coincidences, never someone who claims to sense things before they happen. Never someone who puts much weight in horoscopes or DJ vu the way some people tend to. That's actually a big part of why this particular story has always stood out so much within our family. He doesn't tell it the way someone tells an old story they've dressed up and embellished purely for dramatic effect. He tells it the exact same way he'd describe anything else that genuinely happened to him. Calm, measured, matter of fact. Which somehow ends up making it land even harder than if he told it with more obvious theatrical flair. I remember the very first time he told me this story. I must have been somewhere around 10 or 11 years old at the time, sitting together at our kitchen table on some completely ordinary evening when the conversation happened to drift, the way conversations sometimes naturally do, toward old stories from his own childhood. He told it exactly the same way I've laid it out here, calm and steady all the way through, right up until the point where the door actually begins opening in reality. And even then, his voice never rose dramatically or took on any kind of performative edge to it. If anything, it actually got a little quieter, more careful, as though he was still choosing his words precisely, even after all those years, still visibly a little unsettled by the memory even sitting safely at his own kitchen table decades later, retelling it to his own kid across from him, the dinner dishes still sitting between us, completely forgotten in that moment. I've heard him tell that exact same story to plenty of other people since then, too. Extended family members at holiday gatherings. Old friends who ask him what it was like growing up out on that farm, and it never once changes in the retelling, no matter how many years pass between one telling and the next. Not the footsteps, not the pause outside the door, not the slow opening in the dream, followed by waking up, followed by that identical creak and that same door swinging open again in reality only moments later. He stays consistent about the timing every single time as well, always specifying that it was right around 1 in the morning when he first woke up, always mentioning that he was completely alone in the house that particular night. Always finishing the story with that same small detail about staying downstairs with every single light in the house switched on until someone else finally made it home safely. I think part of what makes this story land the way it does, even now, hearing it again and again as an adult myself, is exactly that unwavering consistency. His refusal to ever dress it up or change even a small detail, depending on who happens to be listening at the time, whether it's a close family member or a total stranger hearing it for the very first time at some gathering. It isn't a story he tells purely to entertain people at parties, even though it does tend to quiet down a room fairly reliably whenever he brings it up on his own, usually without anyone even prompting him to share it in the first place. It's simply something that genuinely happened to him once, on an isolated farm out in Nebraska when he was 17 years old, completely alone in a house at 1 in the morning, watching a door that had only just appeared in his nightmare begin slowly opening again in exactly the same way, only moments after he'd woken up fully convinced he was finally safe again for the rest of the night. He's never gone back to actually live in that particular house since his parents eventually sold off the farm years after he'd already moved out and built a life of his own elsewhere, so there's never really been an opportunity for him to test whether anything similar might happen again under different circumstances, at a different point in his life, back in that exact same room where it all originally took place, in that same bed behind that same door. He's mentioned once or twice that he drove past the old property years afterward, mostly just out of curiosity to see what had become of the place, and found the house itself still standing, clearly under new ownership by then, freshly painted and obviously well cared for, giving off no outward sign whatsoever of anything unusual having ever happened inside those old walls he once knew so well as a boy. Whether that particular detail brings him more relief or more lingering curiosity, he's never really said outright, though, knowing him as well as I do, I suspect it leans more toward relief, given how rarely he ever brings the story up entirely on his own, and how quickly he tends to steer the conversation elsewhere once he's finished telling it. Whenever I sit with his story now, as an adult myself, with my own understanding of how dreams, fear, and genuine isolation can combine to produce something legitimately terrifying, even without anything supernatural necessarily being involved at all, I still can't quite shake that one specific detail that gets me every single time. The exact matching sequence playing out between the dream and the waking event. Footsteps drawing near, a heavy pause right outside the door, and then that same door slowly beginning to open, happening identically twice, within a span of what couldn't have been more than a minute or two altogether. That precise overlap between dream and waking reality, occurring back to back with almost no gap separating the two, remains the detail that has always stuck with me the most out of the entire story. The piece that keeps it firmly lodged in my memory as one of the more genuinely unsettling things I've ever personally heard. Made only more believable by the fact that it comes from a man who has never once given me any real reason to doubt the plain, steady way he's always chosen to tell it, year after year, exactly the same. I think about him sometimes, 17 years old, entirely alone in that isolated farmhouse, with nothing but open fields for miles in every direction. No neighbor close enough to hear him if he'd actually needed to call out for real help, rather than simply sitting downstairs waiting for someone to eventually come home. I think about how genuinely frightening it must have been to sit there for however many hours it truly took. Every light in the house burning steadily. Listening to every creak and settle of a building he'd lived in his entire life suddenly sound completely unfamiliar and threatening in a way it never had before that night. And I think about how, decades later, sitting at his own kitchen table telling that same story to his own son, his voice still quiets slightly at that exact same point every time, right as that door begins, once again, to slowly open,